Section 1. The question nobody asks. There is a question sitting right at the center of one of the most beloved television shows ever made, and in 36 years, across nearly 800 episodes, across decades of cultural analysis and fan theory and academic papers and late-night arguments on the internet, almost nobody has asked it directly. Not why Homer Simpson is clumsy, not why he eats so much or drinks so much, or why he keeps his job despite being spectacularly bad at it. Those questions get asked. Those questions have been answered, sort of, in the way that cartoon shows answer things with a shrug and a laugh and a cut to the next scene. The question nobody asks is this: how did Homer Simpson get this way? Not in the sense of what happened to him in any single episode, in the sense of what actually happened. What sequence of events, beginning before Homer was old enough to understand them and continuing through every decade of his adult life, produced a man who struggles with tasks that most people consider basic, a man who falls asleep at safety panels controlling nuclear reactions, a man whose own creator has publicly stated has an IQ of 55, a man who is by any reasonable medical standard cognitively disabled, and who has been cognitively disabled in plain view of his family and his town and his employer for his entire life without a single person stopping to ask why. That is the question this video is going to answer, and the answer is not simple. The answer is not one thing. It is a series of things, layered on top of each other across decades, each one compounding the last, each one making the next one worse, until the man sitting in front of that reactor console in Sector 7G is the logical and almost inevitable result of everything the show has been quietly telling you since the very beginning. To understand why Homer Simpson is the way he is, you have to understand Springfield. And to understand Springfield, you have to be willing to look at it not as a cartoon backdrop, but as a place with a history. A place where specific things happened to specific people and left marks that never healed. A place that has been, for 36 years, gently and persistently showing you the damage while expecting you to laugh at it. So, settle in. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and it is going to go deeper than you might expect. Because what looks, on the surface, like a simple joke about a dopey cartoon dad is actually one of the most complete portraits of inherited damage and systemic neglect in the history of American television. Homer Simpson is not stupid because the writers needed him to be funny. Homer Simpson is stupid because the show spent 36 years explaining exactly what happened to him, and almost nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. Let us start at the very beginning. Not Homer's beginning, exactly, but the beginning of the story that eventually produces Homer. The story of Springfield itself, and of the forces that were already in motion before Homer was born, shaping the town he would grow up in, shaping the air he would breathe, and the water he would drink, and the family that would raise him, and the employer who would eventually own him. Springfield is a town built around a nuclear power plant. That is the central fact of Springfield's existence, and it is so central that the show treats it as furniture. The cooling towers are visible from almost every outdoor scene. The plant is the largest employer in town. It sits at the edge of the community the way a church might sit at the center of a medieval village, dominating the skyline, organizing the economy, defining the social structure of everything around it. The plant is owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. He has owned it for a very long time, long enough that his influence has seeped into every institution in Springfield: the local government, the medical establishment, the school system, the police department in ways that are rarely stated directly, but are visible everywhere you look if you know what you are looking for. And the plant leaks. It has been leaking for as long as it has been operational. This is not speculation. The show tells you this directly and repeatedly. A surprise safety inspection of the Springfield nuclear power plant found 342 separate violations. 342. The cost to bring the facility into compliance with basic safety standards was estimated at $56 million. Burns refused to spend the money. He has been refusing to spend the money for decades. The cooling towers are cracked and have been patched with, and this is canonical, a wad of chewing gum. Radioactive waste has been documented being dumped into bodies of water adjacent to residential areas. Radioactive material has been found on children's playgrounds. The fish in the river near the plant have 3 eyes, and the man whose job it is to prevent all of this from happening The man hired specifically to ensure that the facility operates safely and does not poison the town surrounding it is Homer Simpson. Hold that thought. Because before we can understand what Homer's presence in that job means, we need to understand how Homer became the man who could end up in that job. We need to understand what was done to him, and when, and by whom, and why. The story begins in 1969. Homer is 6 years old. His mother, Mona Simpson, is at home in Springfield. She is married to Abraham Simpson, Homer's father, a man the show portrays as distant and emotionally withholding in ways that are played for comedy but sit, underneath the laughter, as something genuinely sad. Abe is a veteran. He has the rigid, unexpressive emotional style of a certain kind of mid-century American man, the kind who was taught early and thoroughly that feelings were a weakness and that providing materially for your family was the full extent of what a father needed to do. Mona is different. The show gives her warmth and intelligence and a kind of restless moral energy that makes her feel, in the episodes she appears in, like someone who was always a little too awake for the life she was living. She is a housewife in a small town in an era when that was not just a role but an expectation, a social contract you were born into and rarely questioned. She loves Homer. The show is clear about this. She is not a woman who leaves because she stops caring. She is a woman who leaves because she runs out of options. But we will get to that. The point, for now, is that Homer at 6 years old has a mother who loves him and a father who is present but emotionally unavailable. And he is growing up in a town that is already, quietly, beginning to be poisoned. The plant has been operational for years by 1969. The cooling towers were already cracking. The waste was already leaking. The water was already carrying things it should not have been carrying into the homes and the bodies of everyone in Springfield. Homer is 6 years old and he is drinking the water. And then Mona leaves. The specifics of why she leaves and what it cost and what it did to the 6-year-old boy who woke up one morning and found her gone is a story we are going to spend considerable time on later in this video. For now, what matters is the shape of what happens next. Homer loses his mother at 6 years old. He is told, by his father, that she is dead. Not gone, not missing, dead. Abe Simpson constructs a story, finds a grave, builds a lie elaborate enough that Homer will carry it for 27 years without questioning it. And he does this not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a combination of his own emotional limitations and a deal he has struck with a man whose name we will also return to. The result of this lie is that Homer spends his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, and the first 2 decades of his adult life, believing that his mother died when he was small, believing that he is the kind of person a mother can leave, believing, in the wordless way that children believe things they were never told directly, that there is something about him that drives people away. This belief does not present itself as a belief. It presents itself as a personality. It becomes Homer's desperate need for approval, his terror of being disliked, his compulsive warmth towards strangers, his inability to hold a grudge, his willingness to endure humiliation that most people would not tolerate because the alternative conflict, rejection, the risk of someone leaving is unbearable to him in a way he cannot explain and has never examined. And underneath all of that, underneath every joke and every pratfall and every moment where Homer does something so spectacularly foolish that the audience cannot help but laugh, there is a 6-year-old boy who woke up and found his mother gone and spent the rest of his life trying to be lovable enough that nobody else would go. That is where the story of Homer's stupidity actually begins. Before the crayon, before the radiation, before the nuclear plant and the safety inspector job, and the 36 years of accumulated damage. It begins with a child who was handed a wound at exactly the age when wounds shape themselves into personalities, and who was given no tools to understand what had happened to him or why. We are going to trace every layer of this, one at a time, slowly and carefully. We are going to look at the crayon, the literal foreign object lodged in Homer's brain since childhood, and what it means that it was there for decades without anyone finding it or removing it. We are going to look at the nuclear plant and what 30-plus years of proximity to a leaking reactor does to a human brain. We are going to look at Mona and at Abe and at the deal that was made and the silence that was kept. We are going to look at what Homer looks like without the damage, because the show tells you that too, in one of the most devastating episodes it ever produced. And we are going to look at burns. Because Burns is at the center of all of this, not as a cartoon villain twirling a mustache, but as a system, a force. A set of incentives and suppressions and carefully maintained arrangements that have been shaping Homer's life since before Homer understood that his life was being shaped. By the end of this, the joke is not going to be funny anymore. That is not a warning, that is a promise. Because the version of Homer Simpson that emerges when you look at all of this together is not the bumbling idiot of the laugh track. He is something much more interesting and much sadder than that. He is a man who was robbed, early, thoroughly, by people and systems with no particular interest in whether he ever got what was taken from him back, and who has spent 36 years being laughed at for the gaps left by the theft. That is Homer Simpson. That is the real story. And we are going to tell it from the beginning. Take a breath, settle in, the lights are low, and the night is long, and Springfield is waiting. Drop a comment right now. Tell us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're watching from. And if you want to sleep to more videos like this, subscribe. We make these for you. Section 2. The Crayon, a Foreign Object in a Child's Brain. Season 12 of The Simpsons. Episode 9. The episode is called Homer, which stands for nothing in particular but sounds clinical, like a label on a medical file. It aired on January 7th, 2001, and it contains what might be the single most important piece of information the show has ever shared about Homer Simpson. Information that was delivered as a comic premise, resolved within 22 minutes, and then quietly put away as if it had never happened. But it did happen. And the implications do not go away just because the episode ends. Here is what happens. Homer is participating in a medical study for money, because he is Homer, and medical studies for money are the kind of thing Homer does. During the study, researchers perform a scan of Homer's brain, and what they find, buried deep in the left frontal lobe, is a crayon. Not a metaphorical crayon, not a crayon-shaped growth or a crayon-colored lesion. An actual Crayola crayon, yellow, jammed so far up into Homer's nasal passage that it has lodged itself in his brain tissue and has been sitting there, slowly and continuously pressing on his neural architecture for his entire conscious life. The researchers are baffled. Homer is not. He remembers, in a brief flashback, exactly how it got there. He was a child. He was inserting crayons into his nose, the way children do because children are strange and impulsive, and have not yet developed the judgment to understand that some orifices are not for crayons. He pushed one in too far. He felt it go somewhere it was not supposed to go. He stopped talking about it and moved on, the way children also do when something alarming happens, and they instinctively understand that telling an adult will result in an experience that is worse than whatever already occurred. The crayon went in. Nobody noticed. Life continued, and Homer Simpson grew up with a foreign object pressed against his brain. Now, before we get to what happens when the crayon is removed, and what happens is extraordinary, and we will spend considerable time on it, let us sit with this for a moment. Because the existence of the crayon raises a question that the episode, to its credit, actually asks but then does not fully answer. How did nobody find it? Homer Simpson has been a resident of Springfield for his entire life. He has been employed by the Springfield nuclear power plant for decades. Employment at a nuclear facility, in the real world, requires regular medical clearance. It requires cognitive assessments. It requires, at minimum, some baseline evaluation of whether the person being trusted with a nuclear reactor is functioning within normal parameters. Homer has also, over the course of the show, visited doctors in Springfield on dozens of occasions. He has been hospitalized. He has had X-rays, brain scans, full physical workups. He has been evaluated by Springfield medical professionals for injuries ranging from the mundane to the catastrophic. And in none of these visits, across decades of medical care in a town with a functioning hospital, did anyone find the crayon. The episode offers two possible explanations for this, and it offers them both somewhat casually, as if they are equally plausible. The first explanation is that the medical professionals of Springfield are simply incompetent, that the level of care available in the town is so low and the equipment so outdated and the attention of the doctors so intermittent that a foreign object in a patient's brain could go undetected indefinitely. This explanation is consistent with a lot of what the show depicts about Springfield's institutions. The Springfield police are legendarily bad at their jobs. The Springfield school system is underfunded and mismanaged. It is not a stretch to imagine that the Springfield medical establishment shares these qualities. The second explanation is darker and is not stated directly but hovers over the episode like weather. The second explanation is that someone knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. This explanation requires a motive. And the motive, if you have been paying attention to the architecture of Springfield's power structure, is not hard to find. A Homer Simpson with a crayon in his brain is a Homer Simpson with an IQ of 55. A Homer Simpson without a crayon in his brain is, as the episode reveals, something else entirely. Something considerably more difficult to keep in Sector 7G of a nuclear power plant without asking questions. We will return to the question of who benefits from Homer's cognitive limitation. That question deserves its own section, and it is going to get one. For now, let us stay with the crayon itself. The researchers at the medical study refer Homer to a specialist. The specialist confirms what the scan shows. There is a crayon in Homer's brain. It can be removed. The procedure is not particularly complicated. It requires going back in through the same route, the nasal passage, and extracting the object that has been pressing on Homer's frontal lobe since he was a small child. Homer agrees to have it removed, and what happens next is the part of the episode that stays with you. The morning after the procedure, Homer wakes up, and he is different. The first thing he does is read the newspaper, not glance at it. Read it? He sits down, and he reads the newspaper with comprehension and retention and the ability to form opinions about what he is reading. He reads the op-ed section. He reads the science section. He reads the financial section and understands what he is reading. He starts talking differently. His vocabulary expands almost immediately. He begins to express complex thoughts in complete sentences. He starts connecting ideas, cause and effect, precedent and consequence in ways that the pre-crayon Homer never managed. He goes to work at the plant, and for the first time in his career, he understands what he is looking at: the instruments, the readings, the procedures, the protocols that exist for reasons he can suddenly, for the first time, actually comprehend. The show assigns Homer a post-crayon IQ of 105. The previous estimate with the crayon in place was 55. That is a 50-point swing. That is the difference between functional disability and perfectly normal adult cognition. The difference between a man who cannot understand a memo and a man who can write one. Between a man who forgets his children's names during moments of stress and a man who can anticipate what his children need before they ask. 50 points. From a crayon. And Homer is not just smarter. He is aware of being smarter, which is its own particular kind of experience. He can feel the difference. He can feel the fog lifting, the way you feel a headache receding after you take something for it. Except the headache has been there his entire life, and he did not know it was a headache, because he had nothing to compare it to. He starts seeing Springfield differently. He looks at his job and understands, for the first time, how dangerous it is, how inadequate the safety protocols are, how many things are wrong with the facility where he has spent his adult life without knowing enough to be alarmed by any of them. He writes a report. He submits it. He identifies specific hazards and specific solutions and presents them to the appropriate authorities with the kind of clarity and specificity that comes from actually understanding the subject matter. He looks at his friendships and sees them clearly for the first time. Lenny and Carl, his closest friends at the plant, the men he has spent decades sitting with at Moe's Tavern, remain warm toward him, but the conversations they have been having for years start to feel thin to Homer in a way they never did before. Not because Lenny and Carl are bad people. They are not. But because Homer, with the crayon removed, is operating at a level that his social environment has never been calibrated for, and that is isolating in a way that is very hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. He looks at his marriage and sees Marge with new eyes. This part of the episode is genuinely moving, because it complicates the easy reading of Homer and Marge as a comedy couple whose dynamic works because Homer is simple and Marge is patient. What Homer sees, when he looks at his marriage with the clarity the crayon removal gives him, is a woman who has been partnered with someone operating significantly below his own potential, who has nonetheless committed to that partnership with a completeness and a fidelity that is remarkable by any standard, and he is moved by this. He is grateful in a way that the old Homer could not have been, because gratitude requires a certain level of awareness to feel properly. He tells Marge he loves her and means it in a more complex way than he has ever meant it before. And Marge, who loves Homer and always has loved Homer, finds that the new Homer is also harder to be with. Because the new Homer sees things she would rather not have seen. Because the new Homer makes observations that are accurate and therefore uncomfortable. Because being married to someone who is finally operating at full cognitive capacity means being seen in ways that are not always flattering. And Marge has built a certain amount of her identity around being the competent one, the one who holds things together, the one who manages the chaos that Homer generates. The new Homer does not generate the same chaos. And the dynamic that both of them have been living inside for their entire marriage starts to shift in ways that neither of them entirely welcomes. This is not a criticism of Marge. It is an observation about how deeply a person's identity can become entangled with the role they play in a relationship, and how disorienting it is when the terms of that role change. Lisa is the one who responds to the new Homer with uncomplicated delight. She has always been the intellectual of the family, a role that has isolated her within the Simpson household in ways that are, again, played for comedy but sit underneath the laughter as something genuinely lonely. She is brilliant in a family where brilliance is not particularly valued or even recognized. She argues for things nobody wants to hear. She cares about things nobody else cares about. She is 8 years old, and she has been 8 years old her whole life, and she will be 8 years old until the show ends. And in all of that time, she has been inside her own family, largely alone with her intelligence. And then her father takes a crayon out of his brain and becomes someone who can finally keep up with her. Someone who can read what she is reading and follow the argument she is making and engage with her ideas as if they matter, which they do, but which nobody in her immediate circle has ever demonstrated. Homer and Lisa watch nature documentaries together. They have conversations. Real conversations about real things, the kind of back and forth that Lisa has only ever had with teachers or books, or the occasional sympathetic adult who crosses her path and recognizes what she is. Homer is moved by these conversations in a way that is painful to watch, because you can see him understanding, maybe for the first time, who his daughter is, what she is capable of, what she has been carrying alone for her entire life. He sees her and is heartbroken that it took him this long to see her, and he is grateful, and he is already, somewhere underneath the gratitude, beginning to understand what is coming. Because the episode does not end with Homer staying smart. If it did, the show would have to become a different show entirely. The plot would have to accommodate a Homer who understands what is happening at his workplace and refuses to continue enabling it. A Homer who can advocate for himself and for his family and for Springfield in ways that would make him incompatible with the role he has been playing for 12 seasons. The show cannot have that Homer. So the show has to put the crayon back. And here is where the episode becomes something more than a clever premise. Because Homer chooses to put the crayon back, nobody forces him. Nobody tricks him. He makes the decision himself, consciously, with full awareness of what he is giving up. He goes back to the specialist, he asks for the reversal procedure, and he explains why. Being intelligent in Springfield, he says, is too painful. He is not wrong. The episode shows you why he is not wrong. The moment he starts expressing views that are slightly above the median of Springfield discourse, he is excluded, he is avoided. His observations make people uncomfortable. His friendship group at the plant contracts. Moe's Tavern becomes a lonelier place. Springfield is not a community that rewards intelligence. Springfield is a community that rewards conformity, and the form of conformity that is most comfortable for most of Springfield's residents is the comfortable middle distance, not too ambitious, not too questioning, not too aware of the ways in which the systems around you are failing you. Homer, smart, is a man who keeps bumping up against the ceiling of what Springfield will accept. Homer, with the crayon back in, is a man who fits perfectly into the space the town has always made for him. And so, he chooses the fog. He asks Marge to be there for the reversal procedure. He writes a letter to Lisa, explaining his decision in terms that are honest and heartbreaking, and that represent, genuinely, some of the best writing the show has ever produced. He tells her that he loves her and that being her father has been one of the great privileges of his life, and that he is sorry for all the years he was not present enough to understand her. He tells her that being smart has shown him how exceptional she is, and that he hopes she never lets Springfield convince her to be less than she is. And then he goes under, and when he wakes up, the fog is back. The crayon is back. The Homer who wrote the letter, who watched the documentaries, who finally saw his daughter that Homer is gone. The Homer who wakes up is the Homer the show needs him to be. Now, Let us ask the question the episode does not fully ask. Why was the crayon there for so long? Homer says, in the flashback, that he shoved the crayon up his nose as a child. He was young enough that this is entirely plausible. Children do impulsive things with small objects all the time. The initial insertion, the accidental lodging, the child's decision not to tell anyone, all of that is believable. What is not believable, when you sit with it, is that nobody ever found it. Homer was 6 years old when this happened. He was 6 years old in a household with two parents, one of whom, Mona, was attentive and loving and would, by any reasonable assessment, have noticed that her son's behavior changed significantly after this event. Because it would have changed. A foreign object pressing on the frontal lobe does not produce a gradual, invisible change in cognitive function. It produces something you can see, something a mother who is paying attention would notice. Unless, of course, Mona was no longer there to notice. Unless the crayon went in and Homer said nothing about it, and the event coincided, in the timeline of Homer's early childhood, with the period immediately before Mona disappeared. The show is not entirely clear on the exact chronology, but the suggestion is there. The crayon and the disappearance of Homer's mother occupy the same general territory of Homer's early childhood, and the combination of the two, losing his mother and losing 50 points of IQ within a short span of time, begins to sketch the outlines of a story that is considerably darker than a joke about a kid shoving something up his nose. A child who loses his mother at 6 and simultaneously loses significant cognitive function has two simultaneous catastrophes to deal with, and he has to deal with them in a household run by Abraham Simpson, who is not equipped to deal with either one. The crayon goes undetected. It stays undetected. And Homer grows up. He grows up slower than he would have grown up without it. He struggles in school in ways that are attributed to laziness or attitude, rather than neurological impairment. He makes friends. But the friendships are shallow in the way that friendships are shallow, when one person in the friendship is operating significantly below their own capacity and does not know it. He pursues Marge in high school with the persistence and the warmth and the emotional openness that have always been his best qualities, qualities that, interestingly, are not significantly affected by the crayon, because warmth and emotional openness are not primarily frontal lobe functions. He gets Marge. He has Bart. He gets the job at the plant. He has Lisa. He has Maggie. He builds a life in Springfield that is, by the standards of what Springfield offers, a pretty good life. A house on Evergreen Terrace, a family that loves him, a job with enough stability that the bills get paid most of the time. And through all of it, the crayon is in his brain. Through all of it, the fog is there. The 50-point deficit is there. The Homer, who could have been the Homer the episode briefly shows you, is in there too, somewhere behind the chewing and the sleeping and the spontaneous exclamations that have become one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of American television. That Homer exists. He existed before the crayon and he exists after the crayon is removed, and the show confirms, by showing you both versions, that the crayon is not the whole story of what made Homer this way, but it is a significant part of it. The significant question, who knew, and who had reason to keep the crayon in place, is a question we are going to answer. Not yet. But we are building toward it one layer at a time. For now, hold on to this. Somewhere in Homer's skull, for most of his life, there was a small yellow object that was not supposed to be there. And the world built itself around the Homer that object created. And the Homer it created was, in many ways, exactly the Homer that the most powerful person in Springfield needed him to be. That is not a coincidence. That is the beginning of a pattern. Section 3. The nuclear plant and what it has done to Homer's mind. The Springfield nuclear power plant appears in the very first scene of the show's opening sequence. It is the first thing you see after the cloud parts, and the title card appears, the cooling towers, the yellow discharge pipe, the improbable green glow of the water below. The plant is so fundamental to The Simpsons that it is embedded in the show's visual grammar before a single word of dialogue is spoken. And then Homer leaves work at the plant and drives home, and something falls on his head and the credits play and the family jumps onto the couch and nobody gives the plant another thought. Because the plant is furniture. It is background. It is the thing that provides Homer's paycheck and nothing more. Except that is not true, and the show knows it is not true. And if you pay attention, the show has been telling you it is not true since the second season, when a three-eyed fish was pulled out of the river near the plant and held up in front of a gubernatorial candidate as evidence that something catastrophic was happening to the living organisms downstream. Let us talk about what the Springfield nuclear power plant actually is, and what it has actually been doing to the people who live near it and work inside it. The plant is, as noted in the opening of this video, a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is the primary source of electrical power for Springfield, and, by implication, the economic engine around which the entire town is organized. Burns owns it. He has owned it for a very long time. The specifics of when it was built and what safety standards it was built to comply with are never entirely clear in the show, but the evidence points to a facility that is old, that has been poorly maintained for its entire operational life, and that has been leaking radioactive material into the surrounding environment for decades. 342 safety violations we have already established. The cost to fix them? $56 million. Burns refused. The cooling towers are cracked. The waste management practices are, to use a technical term, illegal. The water in the river near the plant is visibly, canonically, producing mutations in the fish that live in it. And Homer Simpson has worked inside this facility, in direct proximity to the reactor core, for his entire adult life. Before we can understand what this means for Homer specifically, we need to understand what chronic low-level radiation exposure does to the human brain, because this is not science fiction. This is documented medical reality, and the show, whether intentionally or not, tracks it with some precision. Ionizing radiation, the kind produced by a nuclear reactor, is damaging to biological tissue in a relatively straightforward way. It penetrates cells and disrupts their structure at the molecular level. Depending on the intensity of the exposure and the duration, this disruption can produce everything from slightly elevated cancer risk to catastrophic systemic failure. The show is not subtle about which end of this spectrum Springfield is on. The three-eyed fish is not a mild anomaly. It is the visible surface of something that has been happening throughout the ecosystem for a long time. The brain is, as biological tissue goes, both highly sensitive to radiation damage and highly complex in the ways that damage expresses itself. Acute radiation exposure. A single high dose produces effects that are dramatic and relatively well documented. Nausea, disorientation, cognitive impairment, eventual neurological collapse if the dose is high enough. Chronic low-level exposure, a lower dose sustained over years or decades, produces effects that are subtler, more insidious, and considerably harder to attribute to any single cause. Chronic low-level radiation exposure affects cognitive function. This is not controversial. Studies of populations living near nuclear facilities, of workers in nuclear industries, of the survivors of nuclear accidents consistently document elevated rates of cognitive impairment, memory disruption, difficulty with executive function, and reduced processing speed. The brain is not designed for continuous low-level bombardment of this kind, and the cumulative effect of years of exposure is a gradual erosion of cognitive capacity that presents, from the outside, as something that looks like aging or like natural variation or like personality. It looks like someone who has always been a little slow, a little forgetful, a little less sharp than the average. It looks, in other words, like Homer Simpson. Now, Homer has a crayon in his brain, and we have already established that the crayon accounts for a significant portion of his cognitive deficit. But the crayon does not account for all of it. The show tells you this, indirectly, through the episode where the crayon is removed. Even with the crayon out, Homer is not a genius. He is not Burns, who operates at a level of strategic sophistication that is almost alien in its precision. He is not Lisa, whose intelligence is the kind that seems to exceed the capacity of her surroundings. He is a man with an IQ of 105, perfectly normal, perhaps slightly above average for the general population, but nothing extraordinary. Which means that even in the best-case scenario, the crayon removed, the most obvious source of impairment eliminated Homer is still not what he might have been without the plant. The plant has been doing its own work, separate from the crayon, gradually and continuously, for the entire time Homer has worked there. The plant got Homer when he was a young man. He was in his early 20s when he took the job, newly married, Bart not yet born. He has been working there for over 3 decades. 3 decades of walking into that facility, 3 decades of sitting at that console, 3 decades of breathing the air inside those walls, which the show establishes is not the same air as outside those walls. The luminous rats that run through the plant's service tunnels are not just a gag. The plutonium paperweight on somebody's desk is not just a gag. The skeleton found in the basement, the human skeleton, in the basement of a working nuclear facility that the show mentions once and never returns to is not just a gag. These are the accumulation of details that paint a picture of a facility where the relationship between the materials being processed and the people doing the processing is casual in a way that would, in any regulated environment, be criminal. Homer sleeps at his workstation. He eats at his workstation. He has, on multiple occasions, handled reactor materials without appropriate protective equipment because he does not understand why the equipment is necessary. He once threw a donut into the reactor core to see if it would grow larger. He has caused or nearly caused several nuclear incidents that were resolved not through proper safety protocols but through luck or through cartoon physics, or through the intervention of other characters who happened to notice before things went entirely wrong. Each of these incidents, within the logic of the show's own universe, would have exposed Homer to levels of radiation that would, in any realistic context, be cause for immediate medical evaluation and significant concern. The show does not treat them as cause for concern. The plant does not treat them as cause for concern. And Homer, who does not understand enough about what he is working with to be frightened of it, treats them as cause for a laugh and a shrug and a donut from the break room. Now, connect this to the crayon. Connect it to the water Homer has been drinking his whole life. Connect it to the air Homer has been breathing his whole life in a town built around a leaking nuclear facility. And begin to see that the cognitive impairment the show locates in a single crayon is actually the product of a system. Multiple inputs, multiple sources, all pointing in the same direction. All conspiring, whether intentionally or not, to produce a Homer Simpson who is operating significantly below his own capacity. The crayon is visible. The crayon was removed and the results were documented and the change was immediate and dramatic and reversible. That makes the crayon useful as a narrative device, but the crayon is not the whole story. The crayon is the visible piece of a much larger picture. The plant is the other piece. And unlike the crayon, which is inside Homer's skull and can, theoretically, be removed, the plant is outside Homer's skull. It is part of the environment Homer lives in. It is the thing he goes to every morning and returns from every evening, and the effects of which he carries home in his body and his bloodstream and the tissue of his brain without knowing it. There is a concept in neuroscience called the allostatic load. It refers to the cumulative biological cost of chronic stress and chronic exposure to harmful environmental factors. The body is remarkably good at adapting to short-term challenges. It is considerably less good at adapting to challenges that never stop. Chronic exposure to toxins, to stress hormones, to environmental pollutants, these things do not produce a single catastrophic breakdown. They produce a gradual, continuous degradation of function, a slow erosion, a body and a brain that are working harder and harder to maintain baseline function against an environment that is continuously working against them. Homer Simpson has one of the highest allostatic loads of any fictional character in television history. He has been dealing with environmental radiation since childhood. He has had a foreign object in his brain for most of his life. He lost his mother at 6 years old and was told she was dead, and spent 3 decades grieving a loss that was not what he was told it was. He works in a facility that is, by the show's own accounting, one of the most dangerous workplaces in the history of fiction. He lives in a town that has been sealed under a glass dome by the federal government because of its toxicity levels. And he does all of this with the warmth and the persistence and the fundamental decency that have always been his best qualities, and which no amount of crayon or radiation or maternal loss has ever managed to fully extinguish. That is the other side of the Homer equation, and we should not forget it. However, we account for his deficits, the crayon, the plant, the childhood loss, the accumulated damage of 3 decades in Sector 7G. What remains, when we strip those things away, is someone who is, at his core, a loving person, someone who tries, someone who fails constantly and spectacularly, and who keeps getting up and trying again, not because he is strategic about it, but because he does not know how to stop. The warmth is not a compensation for the damage. The warmth is Homer underneath the damage. It is what survives when everything else gets chipped away. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay, for a moment, with the plant and what it means that Homer works there. The show has established, across many episodes, that Burns is not ignorant of what his plant is doing to the surrounding environment and the surrounding population. Burns is a man who has been managing his own radiation exposure for decades through a weekly medical regimen that keeps him alive. Burns is a man who understands, at a level of personal, intimate detail, what radiation does to biological systems. Burns runs a pharmaceutical division capable of synthesizing the experimental compounds he requires for his own survival. Burns has personal physicians. Burns has resources. Burns knows what the plant is doing to Springfield, and he has chosen, repeatedly, across decades of operation, not to fix it. Why Homer is at the center of this arrangement, why Homer specifically is the man in Sector 7G, why Burns has maintained Homer in that position despite a documented record of incompetence that should have resulted in termination many times over, is a question that deserves its own section. We are going to get to it. But first we need to understand the ground that Homer is standing on. The environment that shaped him before Burns ever came into the picture, or more precisely, the environment that Burns shaped that Homer was then placed into. We need to talk about Mona Simpson. Section 4. Mona Simpson and the Childhood That Was Stolen. The episode is called Mother Simpson, Season 7, Episode 8. It aired November 19th, 1995, and it is, by widespread agreement among fans and critics alike, one of the finest episodes the show ever produced. Not because it is the funniest, though it has funny moments, because it is honest. Because it takes the comedy of the show seriously enough to ask what it would cost a man like Homer to find out, at roughly 40 years old, that the central loss of his life was a lie. Let us slow down and spend real time here. Because Mona Simpson's story is not a subplot, it is not background color, it is one of the load-bearing walls of the entire structure we have been building, and if we rush through it, we miss the thing that makes everything else make sense. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, was, by the account the show provides, a remarkable woman. Not remarkable in the way that the show usually makes characters remarkable, through specific talents or extreme personality or memorable catchphrases. Remarkable in the quieter way. She was intelligent and morally serious and capable of caring about things beyond her immediate circumstance, which is not as common as we tend to assume. She loved Homer with a directness and a completeness that the show communicates most powerfully through what it costs her to leave him. She was living in Springfield in 1969, married to Abe, mother of Homer, who was 6. Living the life that was available to a woman in that time in that place, which was not a wide life by the standards of what the world was beginning to offer women elsewhere. The world outside Springfield was on fire, in the interesting way that it sometimes is. The counterculture was producing people who believed, with genuine conviction, that the things being done to the world in the name of profit and progress could be challenged and changed. Mona was one of those people. The show depicts her radicalization with the characteristic lightness it brings to everything heavy, but the substance beneath the lightness is real. Mona encountered ideas and people who convinced her that her conscience had claims on her that her domestic role could not satisfy. She became involved with a group of activists, and the group of activists, as groups of activists often did in 1969, identified a target. The target was Mr. Burns, not the nuclear plant, specifically that was already there, already leaking. The specific target was a different facility, a biological weapons laboratory owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, located within Springfield, in which Burns was conducting research into and manufacturing weaponizable pathogens. This is worth pausing on, because it tends to get glossed over in discussions of this episode, and it should not. Burns was not simply a negligent industrialist in 1969. He was not merely the man who owned a leaky nuclear reactor and refused to fix it. He was also the man who, within the same community, was running a germ warfare research program, a laboratory designed to produce biological weapons. In a town where families were raising children, in a town where Homer was 6 years old and going to school and drinking the water, and living the life that 6-year-olds live when their worlds are not yet large enough to include the concept of what a biological weapon is, Mona found out about the lab, and Mona decided to do something about it. The raid was, as the show depicts it, both successful and disastrous. Successful because the group managed to get inside the facility and detonate what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological agents stored inside. The germs were destroyed. The lab was neutralized. The mission was, in its immediate tactical terms, accomplished. Disastrous because of what happened during the escape. In the chaos of the exit, Mona stopped. She stopped because someone had been knocked down, someone who had been hurt in the confusion, who was on the ground and appeared to need help. And Mona, who was the kind of person who stopped to help someone who needed help even when stopping was dangerous, and even when the person who needed help was the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, stopped. She stopped and she helped Burns to his feet, and Burns saw her face. And Burns, whose memory for enemies is extraordinary, the show establishes this across many episodes, filed that face away. He reported her to the FBI. He provided her description. He pursued the case with the tenacity of a man for whom being crossed is not merely an inconvenience but a personal affront that demands permanent resolution. The FBI opened a file on Mona Simpson. And from that moment forward, Mona's life as a member of her own family became impossible. She did not disappear all at once. She had time to understand what was happening, time to make choices. And the choice she made ultimately was to protect Homer and Abe by removing herself from the target zone around them. She could not stay in Springfield without risking Homer being caught in whatever Burns and the government would do when they found her. So she did what she had to do. She kissed Homer while he was sleeping. She did not wake him. Waking him would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant Homer understanding, at 6 years old, why his mother was leaving and who was making her go. Mona was protecting him from that knowledge. The protection, like all protection of this kind, cost more than it saved. She left. Homer woke up. His mother was gone. Abe told him she had died. He chose the word died rather than gone, because gone implies the possibility of return, and Abe, for reasons we will examine in the next section, needed there to be no possibility of return in Homer's understanding. So he found a grave, the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet, which has always been one of the more surreal details the show includes in an episode that is otherwise quite grounded, and he brought Homer to it and told him this was where his mother was buried. Homer was 6 years old. He believed his father. Children believe their fathers, especially children who have just lost their mothers and who are already in the early stages of grief and who need something solid to hold on to. The lie was solid. The lie was a grave. You cannot argue with a grave. A grave says, "This is over. This is not a story that has a different chapter. This is the end." Homer carried the grave with him for 27 years. And here is what those 27 years look like from the inside. A child who believes his mother is dead does not simply grieve and recover. A child who believes his mother died when he was young develops a relationship to loss that shapes every subsequent attachment he forms. The specific texture of this grief, early, permanent, explained by any cause the child can understand, tends to produce a particular kind of adult psychology. An adult who is desperate for connection and terrified of losing it. An adult who overinvests in relationships because every relationship carries the shadow of the one that was taken. An adult who tolerates mistreatment because the alternative conflict, confrontation, the risk of someone leaving, triggers something deep and pre-rational in the nervous system. Homer as an adult is all of these things. He clings to relationships with an intensity that occasionally crosses into desperation. He tolerates being forgotten by his own employer, repeatedly, over years, without confronting the situation, because the confrontation might produce a separation, and separations are unbearable to Homer in a way that goes well beyond the professional. He tolerates being underestimated and dismissed and overlooked because the alternative asserting himself, insisting on being seen, risking the reaction that assertion might provoke is, in Homer's nervous system, more dangerous than it should be for an adult man in the ordinary social situations of ordinary adult life. This is what childhood loss does. This is the specific psychological mechanism. It does not make you timid across the board. Homer is not timid. He takes physical risks constantly, cheerfully, without apparent awareness of the danger involved. But emotional risk, the risk of interpersonal conflict, the risk of demanding things from people, the risk of drawing a hard line and seeing what happens when you do that is where Homer retreats. That is where the 6-year-old who lost his mother is still running the show. And then there is what the loss does to his relationship with male authority figures. Abe Simpson told Homer that his mother was dead. Homer grew up with a father who was emotionally distant, who communicated love primarily through presence rather than warmth, who was not equipped by his own upbringing to give Homer what Homer needed in the aftermath of losing Mona. Abe is not a villain. The show never makes him a villain, though it makes him plenty of other things. He is a man of his generation and his limitations, doing what he could with what he had, which was not enough. But the result for Homer is an early childhood defined by absence. His mother is gone. His father is there but not quite present, not quite reaching Homer where Homer actually lives. And the combination of these two things produces, in Homer, a particular hunger for the approval of male authority figures, for a boss who notices him, for a father substitute who sees him, for someone with power over his world who demonstrates, in some way, that Homer matters. Burns is Homer's employer. Burns does not know Homer's name. Burns has worked with Homer for decades and cannot in most episodes remember who he is. This is played as comedy. Burns' inability to remember Homer is one of the running jokes of the show. But in the psychological register we are operating in, it is one of the cruelest things the show depicts. Because Homer, who is desperate for the approval of authority, who carries his father's withholding and his mother's absence as the foundational losses of his identity, keeps showing up to work for a man who does not remember his name. And he keeps coming back. He keeps trying. He keeps hoping that this time Burns will see him. This time, Burns will remember. This time, the authority figure will do what Abe couldn't do and what Burns never does. Acknowledge that Homer Simpson is there and that his being there means something. He is still waiting. Now, when Homer finally finds his mother, in the Season 7 episode, the reunion is everything you would hope it would be and everything you would fear. Mona is alive. She has been alive. She has spent 27 years on the run, moving from place to place, unable to contact her family, carrying the weight of what she gave up in every town she passed through. She has been waiting, in whatever form waiting takes when you cannot go home, for something to change. For Burns to die, perhaps, or to lose interest, or for enough time to pass that her face on a file somewhere loses its urgency. None of those things happened. Burns is very hard to kill. Burns is extremely hard to make lose interest. And 27 years have passed without enough change to make Mona safe. She meets Homer at a cemetery. He is standing in front of his own fake grave. The show produces the fake death to get Homer to the Hall of Records, where he discovers the truth and she does not recognize him at first. He has grown into a man she has not watched become. He is not the 6-year-old she kissed goodbye. He is whoever he became without her. When he proves who he is, the reunion happens, and it is quiet and specific and honest about what has been lost. 27 years. Homer grew up without her, had Bart and Lisa and Maggie, married Marge, had a whole life. She was not there for any of it. And then Burns spots her through a cab window and calls the authorities. And Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. This time he is not 6 years old. This time he knows she is not dead. This time he knows who is making her go. The man who is making his mother leave again is his employer, the man who cannot remember his name. Homer goes back to work the next day. He does not quit. He does not confront Burns. He does not report what he knows to anyone. He goes back and sits in Sector 7G and falls asleep at the console and eats a donut and the credits roll. And the question, how does he do that? How does a man go back to work for the person who destroyed his family? Not once, but twice, is the question that everything else in this video is building toward answering. Because the answer is not simple. The answer is the crayon, and the radiation, and the childhood, and the 27 years of grief, and a deal that was made without Homer's knowledge, and a system that was designed, from the beginning, to make sure Homer Simpson never understood what was happening to him. Mona Simpson did not just lose her son when she left. She lost the chance to interrupt the story that was already being written for Homer before he was old enough to understand it. The story that, without her presence, without her intelligence, and her moral seriousness, and her willingness to stop and help someone who needed help even when stopping was dangerous, without all of that, the story proceeded without interruption. Burns won that one too. Section 5. Abe Simpson and the Architecture of Silence. There is a particular kind of silence that is not the absence of speech, but the presence of something too heavy to say. You know the kind. You have probably encountered it in your own life, in conversations that never quite happened, in rooms where something important went unspoken for so long that the unspokenness became a kind of furniture. You stopped noticing it was there, but it was shaping the room the whole time. Abraham Simpson lives inside that kind of silence. The show does not ask you to feel too much about Abe. He is a comedy character. He is the doddering old father in the nursing home who tells rambling, contradictory stories about a past that may or may not have happened the way he describes it. He is the grandfather who is well-meaning but disconnected, whose relationship to reality has loosened with age to the point where it is genuinely unclear, in any given scene, how much of what he says reflects actual experience and how much reflects the accumulated distortions of memory and time, and the way old wounds rewrite themselves over decades into something more bearable. But underneath the comedy, Abe Simpson is carrying something. He has been carrying it for a very long time. And the weight of what he carries is, in many ways, the weight of Homer's entire story. Let us start with what we know about Abe. He is a veteran. He served in World War II, and the show depicts his wartime experience with the mixture of pride and absurdism that characterizes most of Abe's stories about his own past. He was there. He did things. He came back changed in the ways that men who were there and did things and came back often came back, changed, closed off, in certain specific ways, from the kind of emotional expression that requires a person to be genuinely vulnerable. The war made Abe, among other things, a man who believed that feelings were something you dealt with by not dealing with them. A man who equated emotional expression with weakness. A man who found it easier to provide than to connect. He married Mona. They had Homer. And the version of the marriage that the show gives us, in the brief glimpses it offers, is not a bad marriage, not in the way that marriages defined by active cruelty are bad. It is a marriage defined by a specific kind of incompatibility. Mona was awake to the world in a way that Abe, with his rigidly defined parameters for what a person should care about and how much, was not prepared for. She had a conscience that reached beyond the house on Evergreen Terrace. He had a loyalty to the house on Evergreen Terrace that did not know how to accommodate a conscience that reached beyond it. This is not a condemnation of Abe. It is a description of a man who was shaped by his time and his experience into someone with a very particular kind of limitation. He was not cruel. He was not neglectful in the obvious ways. He was present. He showed up. He provided. He just did not, could not, give Homer the specific things Homer needed most. The warmth. The words. The acknowledgement that Homer mattered in a way that went beyond the fact of Homer's existence. The things Mona gave freely and naturally, and that disappeared when Mona left. Now, Mona left in 1969. Homer was in 6. And Abe was left alone with a 6-year-old boy whose mother had just become a federal fugitive and whose father had just been made, by the circumstances of Mona's departure, into a man with a secret. The secret is this: Mona did not die. She is alive. She is a fugitive. She cannot come back. And the reason she cannot come back, the reason she is being hunted, the reason she destroyed Burns's biological weapons laboratory, the reason Burns is personally pursuing her with the resources of a man who considers personal grudges a legitimate use of unlimited wealth, is a story that implicates Burns in things that Burns would very much prefer not be widely understood. Abe knows this. Abe knows all of it. He knows where Mona went and why. He knows who is chasing her. He knows that the reason his wife is gone is not death, but a man, a specific man. A man who lives in Springfield and who owns the nuclear power plant and who has more money and power and institutional influence than any other person in the town. And Abe tells Homer she is dead. Why? The easy answer is protection. Homer is 6 years old. The truth: your mother is a radical activist who broke into a billionaire's weapons lab and destroyed his biological agents and is now being hunted by the FBI and cannot come home, is not a truth. A 6-year-old can live inside safely. It would make Homer a target, potentially. It would certainly make Homer's life more complicated, more frightening, more defined by a conflict he has no tools to navigate. Protection, as a motive for the lie, is understandable. But protection is not the only motive, because the lie once told has to be maintained. And maintaining a lie requires a kind of ongoing commitment that goes beyond the initial impulse to protect. Abe maintained this lie for 27 years. He maintained it through Homer's adolescence, through Homer's marriage, Through the birth of Homer's children, he maintained it past the point where any protective rationale could fully account for its continuation. He maintained it, the show eventually reveals, because the lie was connected to something larger than Abe's desire to protect his son. There was a deal. We are going to talk about the deal in the next section, because the deal deserves to be understood on its own terms. But for now, what matters is this. Abe Simpson told his son a lie, and then he told that lie every day for 27 years. And the effect of that lie on Homer's psychology was profound and lasting, and cannot be separated from everything else that made Homer who he is. Consider what the lie does to a child. A child who is told his mother is dead is a child in a sealed room. There is no door. There is no window. There is no version of the future in which the door opens. The death is permanent and complete, and the only thing to do with it is to carry it. The child cannot hope. The child cannot wait. The child cannot maintain the open wound that a missing parent creates when there is a chance, however small, that the missing parent might return. Death forecloses all of that. Death says, stop looking. Stop hoping. She is not coming back. This is over. Homer stopped looking. Homer stopped hoping. Homer folded the loss into himself and built himself around it in the way that people build themselves around their wounds when the wounds are presented as permanent. But the wound was not permanent. The door was not sealed, and the version of Homer who might have existed if he had known, growing up, that his mother was alive and that her absence was not a reflection of anything about him that Homer was never built. Because the lie was there. The lie was in the way. The lie was the architecture of Homer's relationship to his own history. Here is the thing about Abe Simpson that the show gives you in pieces, over many episodes, that adds up to something coherent if you are patient with it. Abe is not a malicious person. He is not scheming. He is not cold. He tells stories with warmth and enthusiasm, even when the stories contradict themselves and even when it is unclear whether any of them actually happened. He goes to Homer's school events. He shows up. He tries, in the limited and specific ways that his limitations allow him to try. But he is a man who learned early that certain things cannot be fixed, and that the appropriate response to things that cannot be fixed is to not look at them. He learned this in the war, probably. He refined it in the years after the war. He perfected it in the years after Mona left, when not looking at the thing that could not be fixed was the strategy that made it possible to get up in the morning and make Homer's breakfast and drive him to school and pretend that the absence in the house was the ordinary. Absence of death rather than the specific, targeted, politically motivated absence of a woman being hunted by a man who glowed in the dark. The architecture of Abe's silence is the architecture of avoidance at a scale that most people never attempt. Most people avoid small things, specific painful topics, individual memories that are better left unexamined. Abe avoided the entire foundational narrative of his family. He constructed a replacement narrative. Homer's mother is dead. She died when you were young. She loved you. This is the grave, and he maintained it. Against all comers, against all evidence. Against the 27-year persistence of a lie that required, every single day, the active choice not to correct. What does it do to a person to live inside that kind of silence? What does it do to the person keeping it? The show gives you hints. Abe is erratic. His relationship to reality is, as noted, loosely tethered. His stories contradict themselves in ways that could be attributed to age and memory, but could also be attributed to decades of maintaining a false narrative, making it harder to maintain any narrative with complete reliability. A man who has been selectively untrue for 30 years begins to lose track of which version of events is the real one and which is the constructed one. The constructions accumulate. The real thing gets buried under them. Abe is also, in a specific and consistent way, unable to receive Homer's love. Homer loves his father. The show makes this clear. Homer tries, repeatedly, to connect with Abe in the way that Homer tries to connect with everyone he loves, with persistence and warmth and a willingness to be embarrassed, to be silly, to disregard his own dignity in service of the connection he is after. And Abe receives this love with the warmth of a man who wants to feel more than he can feel, who recognizes that what is being offered is good and wishes he were equipped to fully receive it. But Abe cannot fully receive it, because fully receiving Homer's love would require Abe to be fully present with Homer, and being fully present with Homer means being fully present with the lie, with what the lie has cost Homer. With the 27 years of Homer grieving a mother who was not dead, with the version of Homer that never got built because the door was sealed with a false grave in a Springfield cemetery, Abe avoids all of this the way he has learned to avoid all things that cannot be fixed. By not looking at it, by talking around it, by telling another story, a funnier one about the war, or about his generation, or about something that happened in 1940, something that may or may not have occurred. The silence holds. The truth waits. And Homer grows up inside the silence, shaped by the lie, carrying the weight of a loss that was real in its effects even if it was not real in its cause. There is something important to say about what Abe's silence does to Homer's relationship with his own history. Because Homer, unlike most people, does not have reliable access to his own past. His father has constructed a version of his past that is false in its most important dimension. His mother is gone and has been told as dead. The story of why his family is the way it is has been replaced with a cover story, and the cover story is the only story Homer has. This means that when Homer tries to understand himself, which he does, occasionally, in the moments of introspection that the show grants him, he is working with false material. He cannot trace his psychology accurately to its sources because the most important source has been obscured. He knows he is afraid of abandonment. He does not know why the fear is so acute. He knows he is desperate for approval from authority figures. He cannot connect that desperation to the specific authority figure, the specific man who drove his mother away and kept her gone. He knows there is a hole in himself that he has never been able to fill. He cannot see the shape of the hole clearly because the story he was given about how the hole got there was never the true story. Homer lives his entire life doing emotional archaeology without a map, digging in the wrong places, finding things that make sense as individual artifacts but that cannot be assembled into a complete picture because the picture was disrupted at the level of the primary source. This, too, is part of why Homer is the way he is. The crayon, the radiation, the plant, these things affect his cognitive capacity, his processing speed, his executive function. But what Abe's silence does is something different. It affects Homer's ability to understand himself, to make sense of his own patterns, to connect what he feels to why he feels it, to see the architecture of his own damage clearly enough to begin to address it. Homer cannot do any of that. Because the architecture was obscured before he was old enough to learn to read it, this is Abe Simpson's contribution to Homer's story. Not evil, not malice. A silence, maintained across decades, that kept the truth in the dark while Homer stumbled around in it. And behind the silence, there is a deal. Section 6. The deal that kept Homer dumb. At some point in the history of the Simpson family, a transaction took place. It was not a financial transaction exactly, though money was involved in the way that money is always involved when one party has it and the other party needs something. It was more like the kind of arrangement that small towns produce, when the power differential between two parties is extreme enough that the weaker party's only leverage is information, dangerous information, the kind that the stronger party would pay significant ongoing costs to suppress. The show reveals this arrangement across two separate pieces of evidence that are, on their own, easy to dismiss as individual gags, but that, taken together, describe something remarkably specific about the relationship between the Simpson family and Charles Montgomery Burns. The first piece of evidence is this: Homer Simpson cannot be fired. This sounds simple but is, in context, extraordinary. We have already established that Homer is a spectacularly bad safety inspector. The show documents, across many seasons, 742 separate workplace errors attributable to Homer. 742. This is a number the show mentions almost casually, as if the accumulation of more than 700 documented failures to perform the basic functions of one's employment is the kind of thing that just happens to people in the ordinary course of a career. It is not the kind of thing that just happens to people. In any normally functioning workplace, Homer would have been dismissed after the first handful of incidents. In a workplace that takes the safety of a nuclear reactor seriously, which the Springfield plant does not, but which in theory it should, given that the consequences of a nuclear accident are not the kind of consequences you recover from easily, Homer would have been dismissed immediately, possibly prosecuted, certainly never permitted within 100 meters of the reactor again. Homer is not dismissed. Homer keeps showing up. Homer keeps falling asleep at the console and eating donuts during meltdown warnings and handling nuclear material with the casual indifference of a man who has never been given adequate reason to understand what nuclear material is. And the plant keeps employing him. When the plant was briefly sold to German investors, episode details for the aficionados, Season 6, Episode 12, the Bart tries to impress Burns episode has adjacent material, but the German investor sale is documented separately. The first thing the new owners did was conduct an actual assessment of their workforce. And the first casualty of that assessment was Homer. The Germans fired him immediately, within their first week of ownership, not because they had anything against Homer personally, because they were doing what any rational employer does, evaluating whether their employees are performing their designated functions. Homer was not performing his designated function. Homer was, by any objective measure, actively impeding the performance of his designated function. He was fired, and then Burns bought the plant back and rehired Homer. Burns, who controls the plant and who could staff it with anyone, brought Homer back, not because Homer is qualified, not because Homer has demonstrated competence, because Burns specifically and deliberately wants Homer in that seat. The second piece of evidence is the deal itself. The show reveals, in a later episode, that Burns and Abe Simpson struck an agreement. The specifics are presented briefly, in the way the show tends to present things that are extremely dark, wrapped in a layer of lightness that makes them easier to absorb. Burns had done something. We are not given all the details of what Grandpa Simpson. Abe had knowledge of what Burns had done, knowledge that, if it became public, would have been damaging to Burns in ways that someone with somewhat less institutional protection might have found genuinely consequential. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer's employment, not good employment. Not employment with the prospect of advancement or recognition or the simple professional dignity of a job that matches one's abilities, just employment. The promise that Homer would have a seat at the plant for as long as Homer wanted one, regardless of his performance, regardless of the number of documented errors, regardless of anything that Homer did or failed to do in the execution of his duties. Homer's job security was not an accident. It was not Burns's negligence or forgetfulness. It was the fulfillment of a contract. Think about what this means. Abe knew something about Burns that Burns was willing to pay to suppress. And what Abe asked for, in exchange for his silence, was not money, not personal protection, not anything for himself. He asked for Homer to have a job, a steady job, at the most reliable employer in Springfield, for as long as Homer needed it. This is, in a certain narrow reading, a loving thing for a father to do. Abe was securing his son's future. In a town with limited economic opportunity, where the plant is the primary employer, and where being blacklisted from the plant would significantly constrain one's options, ensuring that your son has permanent employment at the plant is a practical form of parental provision. But the job he secured for Homer was the worst possible job for Homer to have. Working at the nuclear plant, specifically in the proximity to reactor materials that Homer's position entails, means that Homer has spent his entire adult life being exposed to exactly the environmental factors that are most damaging to a brain that is already compromised by a crayon. The plant that Burns runs badly, by design, because running it badly is cheaper than running it safely, is an environment of chronic low-level radiation exposure and chemical toxins and stress, and the particular cognitive deterioration that comes from spending 3 decades doing work that is both meaningless and dangerous without adequate understanding of either the meaninglessness or the danger. Burns did not just secure Homer's employment at the plant. Burns secured Homer's exposure to the plant. And the plant, as we have established, does damage over time. Slow, cumulative, compounding damage to the one thing Homer needs most, which is the capacity to understand what is happening to him. This is the deal. This is what Abe bought for his son. A lifetime of employment in an environment that would gradually, systematically, confirm and compound every other source of cognitive damage in Homer's history. A job he could never lose, at a place he would have been better off never walking into. The genius of this arrangement, from Burns's perspective, is that it is entirely self-reinforcing. Homer working at the plant means Homer exposed to the plant. Homer exposed to the plant means Homer slowly losing cognitive function. Homer slowly losing cognitive function means Homer less and less able to understand the arrangement he is inside. And Homer less able to understand the arrangement means the arrangement maintains itself indefinitely, requiring no ongoing active intervention from Burns to keep Homer in line. Burns does not need to monitor Homer. Burns does not need to manage Homer. Burns barely needs to remember Homer's name, which, famously, he cannot do. Because the system Burns has constructed around Homer manages Homer without requiring anyone's conscious attention. The plant does the work. The decades of exposure do the work. The crayon, sitting in its place, does its work too. And the lie Abe told does its work, keeping Homer from the self-understanding that might otherwise produce questions. Homer is managed by his environment. And his environment was designed not for Homer specifically, but for someone exactly like Homer to prevent the kind of clear thinking that would allow him to see what his environment is doing to him. There is another layer to this deal that deserves attention. When the deal was struck, Burns was trading Homer's future employment for Abe's silence about something Burns had done. We are not given the full details of the wrongdoing, but we can make some inferences based on what we know about Burns's history. Burns has been running a nuclear plant with 342 safety violations for decades. Burns has been dumping radioactive waste into the water supply of a residential community. Burns ran a biological weapons laboratory in Springfield in 1969. Burns has been purchasing political influence throughout Springfield's history, shaping elections and appointments and regulatory decisions to ensure that the plant and its practices never face the full consequences that the law in a functioning system would impose. Any of these things, and the list is almost certainly not exhaustive, represents exactly the kind of information that could be dangerous to Burns if it reached the right people at the right time. Abe, who knew about Mona's raid on the biological weapons laboratory, who presumably knew about the circumstances that made Mona a fugitive, who had been living in Springfield's proximity to the plant for decades, would have had access to a significant amount of information that Burns would prefer to keep contained. The deal contains it. The deal keeps Abe quiet about what he knows. The deal keeps Homer employed in a position that compounds Homer's cognitive damage. And the deal keeps the story the real story, the one about the biological weapons lab and Mona's raid and Burns's decades of environmental crimes, safely buried under the comfortable alternative narrative of a man who is simply not very bright. Homer is the cover story. Homer, stumbling around Sector 7G, unable to find the door or remember his password, dropping his donuts and falling asleep during safety drills. Homer is the explanation. He is there, and he is there like that. And the fact of his presence explains itself without requiring anyone to look deeper. Of course, nothing works properly at the plant. Have you seen who they have running the safety department? Of course, the violations never get addressed. Have you seen how the safety inspector behaves? The plant doesn't need a more convenient explanation for its failures than Homer. Homer is the explanation, which is, from Burns's perspective, perfect. Because the real explanation, the one that involves deliberate regulatory non-compliance and decades of environmental crime and a biological weapons program and the persecution of a woman who tried to stop it, that explanation is tucked away behind Homer Simpson, who is going to go on being Homer Simpson indefinitely, because the deal ensures his employment and the plant ensures his continued decline, and the crayon that nobody has found ensures that the man who might otherwise start asking questions remains safely below the cognitive threshold where those questions become possible, until the crayon gets removed. And everything changes for 22 minutes, and then it gets put back in. But we have talked about the crayon, and we have talked about the deal. What we have not yet talked about is what Homer actually looks like when all of the above is stripped away. Not just the crayon, all of it. The radiation, the loss, the lie, the deal, the plant, the decades of accumulated damage. What is underneath? The show tells you, in pieces, across many episodes. The full picture is available if you are patient enough to assemble it. Let us assemble it. Section 7. What Homer looks like without the damage. There is a version of Homer Simpson that exists in the cracks of the show, not in the main storylines. Not in the plots where Homer fails his driving test again, or eats something he should not eat, or has an adventure that is resolved by the end of 22 minutes without leaving any lasting mark on his character. In the cracks, in the moments between the jokes, in the episode where the crayon comes out, and the episode where his mother comes back, and the episodes where Homer is, against the usual logic of the show, allowed to be fully himself for long enough to see who that person actually is. What you find in those moments is not a genius, not a misunderstood intellectual trapped in a buffoon's body. What you find is something more interesting and more complicated than that. You find a person with real warmth and real curiosity and real love that expresses itself in ways that are, when the fog lifts even a little, specific and sensitive and surprisingly thoughtful. The post-crayon Homer is the clearest glimpse. 105 IQ. Not extraordinary, not transformative by the standards of what intelligence can do in the world, but enough. Enough to read and comprehend. Enough to understand the work he is doing and the hazards it presents. Enough to connect cause and effect across more than one step. Enough to see Springfield and understand, for the first time, what he has been inside of. But the post-crayon Homer is not the only evidence. The show has been offering evidence throughout its run, in smaller amounts, in moments that get less attention precisely because they do not announce themselves as revealing. Consider Homer's creativity. When Homer is engaged with something, he loves food, primarily, but also music, also the occasional adventure that genuinely captures his imagination. He demonstrates an inventiveness that is inconsistent with the 55 IQ the show assigns him. He has invented foods. He has improvised solutions to practical problems in ways that require genuine spatial reasoning. He has, in specific and motivated circumstances, displayed a capacity for lateral thinking that his general presentation does not suggest. This is the rubber band stretched tight. Under normal conditions, Homer's cognitive resources are being consumed by the work of navigating a compromised brain through a demanding world. The crayon presses on his frontal lobe. The radiation has eroded his baseline processing capacity. The emotional weight of his childhood losses has occupied significant neural bandwidth for decades. When Homer is operating in neutral, managing the ordinary demands of daily life, the available capacity is thin. But when Homer is operating in his element, when the demand is specific and the engagement is genuine and the emotional stakes are high enough to mobilize whatever resources are available, he can do things that the 55 IQ does not predict. He can love his family with a specificity that is, frankly, moving. He can tell his children things that are exactly right at exactly the right moment, in the way that people who are emotionally intelligent sometimes can, even when their other forms of intelligence are compromised. He can be funny, genuinely funny, in the way that requires timing and awareness and the ability to read a room, which is a form of social intelligence that persists in Homer even when other forms do not. The warmth is the most important piece of what remains. We have mentioned it before, and we will come back to it. Homer's capacity for connection, for loving people, and expressing that love in ways they can receive, and for wanting, with genuine sincerity, the people around him to be okay, is the thing that no amount of crayon or radiation has managed to extinguish. It is the thing that was true of Homer before the damage and is still true of Homer after decades of the damage, and will presumably be true of Homer if he is ever given circumstances that do not continuously compound the damage. This is what a human being looks like when you strip away everything that has been done to them. Not their achievements, not their IQ score, not the external markers of what the world calls success. What they are is the irreducible thing, the thing that no set of circumstances has been able to eliminate. And Homer's irreducible thing is his love. For Marge, for his kids, for the particular, specific, irreplaceable human beings who happen to be his people. The show demonstrates this in the emotional register of its best episodes. When Homer talks to Lisa in the Homer episode, before the reversal, he is demonstrating something that an IQ score cannot fully capture. He sees her. He sees who she is and what it has cost her, and what it will cost her to remain herself in a world that does not reward the kind of person she is. He tells her, in the letter he writes before going back under, that she should never let Springfield convince her to be less than she is. He does not have the post-crayon vocabulary for very long, but he has long enough to use it for what matters most. That capacity to see his daughter and love her specifically for who she is, rather than in the general, unfocused way that Homer loves. When the fog is thick, that is Homer without the damage, not the IQ number, not the verbal fluency, or the ability to read a newspaper. The ability to look at the person in front of him and see them, he has it. He has always had it under everything. The damage obscures it more in some moments than others. But it is there. It has always been there. Now let us think about what Homer might have been in the specific and speculative sense of imagining the causal chain differently. Suppose Mona does not leave. Suppose Burns does not see her face during the raid. Suppose she comes home and Homer is 7 years old and he grows up with both parents, with a father who is still limited in the ways Abe is limited, but who is balanced by a mother who is warm and engaged and capable of providing what Abe cannot, who is intelligent in a way that Homer, without the crayon and without the plant and without the grief, might have access to as a model. Who is morally serious in a way that might have given Homer, as he grew up, a framework for understanding what the world around him was doing and why it was doing it. Suppose the crayon comes out at some point in Homer's childhood because Mona takes him to a doctor who actually looks. Because Mona is the kind of mother who takes her child to a doctor and pays attention to what the doctor finds. Because the removal happens at 6 or 7 rather than at 40, and the years of cognitive development that follow happen without the 50-point deficit. What is that, Homer? The show gives you a glimpse, in the 22 minutes of the Homer episode, of the adult who exists when the crayon comes out. That Homer writes a lucid letter to his daughter. That Homer engages with the world with clarity and warmth and something that approaches wisdom. That Homer, in 22 minutes of screen time, does more for his relationship with Lisa than 37 prior years of screen time have managed. Extrapolate that Homer back to childhood. Give him Mona. Give him the intact frontal lobe and the mother and the absence of the specific childhood losses that shaped the adult Homer into someone who tolerates the intolerable, because he was taught very young that the intolerable is what there is. That Homer is not a safety inspector at a nuclear plant with 742 documented errors. That Homer is not a man who does not know his boss's name for the opposite reason his boss does not know his. That Homer is not the explanation for the plant's continued operation and the continued suppression of the truth about what the plant is doing. That Homer is a problem for Burns. That Homer is someone who might, in the right circumstances, become exactly the kind of person who asks the questions that Burns cannot afford to have answered. The damage was not an accident. That is the thesis. It was not a random accumulation of misfortunes that happened to produce exactly the kind of person Burns needed in Sector 7G. It was the predictable result of a series of arrangements and conditions and maintained silences that Burns either created or benefited from or both. The Homer who exists without the damage is the Homer who might have stopped the plant, who might have understood what the plant was doing and demanded accountability and had the cognitive resources and the psychological stability and the absence of the particular brand of learned helplessness that Mona's fake death and Abe's deal produced to do something about it. That Homer never got built. Burns made sure of it, not through a specific intervention targeted at Homer, not through a mustache-twirling scheme with Homer's name on it. Through a system. Through the maintenance of conditions in the plant, in the town, in the Simpson family, in the specific deal struck with an old man who needed something for his son that made the damaged Homer not just possible but inevitable. That is the argument this video is making. Homer Simpson is not stupid because nature made him stupid. Homer Simpson is stupid because a set of specific, identifiable factors produced his cognitive limitation, and those factors were shaped and maintained and in some cases directly caused by the same person who benefits most from Homer's presence in Sector 7G. The crayon happened to Homer, the plant happened to Homer. His mother leaving happened to Homer. His father's silence happened to Homer. The deal happened to Homer, around Homer, without his knowledge or consent. And the accumulation of all of it produced a man who is easy to laugh at and who provides an excellent cover story for the criminal negligence of the facility where he works. That is what Homer looks like without the damage. And that is what the damage looks like once you see it clearly. Section 8. Springfield's Medical Establishment and the Cover-Up. There is a doctor in Springfield named Julius Hibbert. Dr. Hibbert has been the Simpson family physician for the duration of the show's run. He is cheerful. He laughs at things sometimes, things that do not seem, on the surface, to warrant laughter. He is competent within the show's context, which means that his competence is demonstrated primarily through contrast with the general standard of Springfield medicine, rather than through any particularly impressive display of diagnostic precision. Dr. Hibbert has examined Homer Simpson many times. He has treated Homer for injuries sustained in circumstances that range from mildly implausible to physically impossible. He has been present for Homer's hospitalizations, his near-death experiences, the accumulated medical history of a man who has been beaten, electrocuted, shot, run over, fallen from heights, and exposed to more radiation than any reasonable estimate of the permissible lifetime dose. Dr. Hibbert did not find the crayon. This is not a knock on Hibbert specifically, or at least not only a knock on Hibbert specifically. It is an observation about Springfield medicine that the show supports at every level. Springfield General Hospital is not an advertisement for the quality of care available within its walls. The show has depicted surgical errors, diagnostic failures, and the kind of institutional indifference to patient outcomes that suggests a medical establishment operating well below the standard its patients would prefer and deserve. But there is a difference between a medical establishment that is simply bad, underfunded, undertrained, distracted, the way that institutions in underfunded towns often are, and a medical establishment that is bad in specific ways that consistently benefit the most powerful person in the town. Let us think about what adequate medical care in Springfield would have discovered over the decades. It would have discovered the crayon. A standard neurological scan, not an advanced procedure, not something that requires exceptional equipment or expertise, would have revealed a foreign object in a patient's frontal lobe. The fact that Homer went through decades of Springfield medical care without any doctor finding or reporting this suggests either extraordinary incompetence or extraordinary selective attention. The incompetence is plausible. The selective attention is darker. It would have discovered, and properly attributed, the effects of chronic radiation exposure on the patient populations living near the plant. There are specific biomarkers for this. There are specific presentations in blood counts, in cancer rates, in neurological evaluations that distinguish communities with elevated radiation exposure from communities without it. A medical establishment that was paying attention to its patients and that was communicating its findings to the appropriate regulatory bodies would have produced data that made the plant's effects on Springfield undeniable. The data does not appear to have been produced. The regulatory bodies do not appear to have been alerted. The plant has been operating for decades with the apparent endorsement of the town's medical establishment, or at minimum without its active opposition. Who employs a significant portion of Springfield's medical infrastructure? Who has the resources to endow a medical research center, to fund a hospital wing, to make the kind of donations to civic institutions that translate, in a small town, into the kind of institutional goodwill that makes it easier to look the other way when looking the other way is convenient? Burns is the answer to all of these questions. Burns, in the way of all wealthy and powerful people in small communities, is not simply the owner of a business. He is a presence. He is the man whose name is on the building. He is the man whose donations fund things that the town genuinely needs. He is the man whose displeasure has observable consequences for the people who earn his displeasure. Doctors who find things Burns would rather not have found do not necessarily receive direct threats or explicit instructions to suppress their findings. That is not how this kind of institutional capture works. The process is subtler and more ambient. It is the understanding, built up over years of living and working in a town that Burns owns in the practical sense, that certain findings produce certain outcomes, that flagging certain observations draws certain kinds of attention, that a medical career in Springfield is easier to sustain if it stays within the range of what the most powerful person in town has determined to be clinically relevant. Dr. Hibbert laughs at things that do not warrant laughter. He laughs the way someone laughs when they have decided that the thing in front of them is not their problem, and that the best way to signal that it is not their problem is to treat it as a joke. That laugh is, if you listen to it, not quite the laugh of someone who finds something genuinely funny. It is the laugh of someone who has found a social strategy for not engaging with things that engaging with would be expensive. This is speculation about a cartoon character, granted, but it is speculation that the show supports obliquely through the pattern of what Springfield medicine fails to do. The flu episode, Season 4, Episode 12, Marge versus the monorail, is in this era, but the relevant episode is Bart gets hit by a car and its adjacents, and the more specific evidence comes from a cluster of episodes in the middle seasons where medical incompetence is a recurring theme. These episodes collectively suggest a medical establishment that has a particular failure mode. It is not random failure. It fails in ways that happen to align with the interests of the town's most powerful resident. Now let us talk about a specific and under-examined piece of evidence. The show has established, in one of its most memorable scenes, that Mr. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Not some diseases, every disease, simultaneously. This is presented as an absurdity, a joke about the paradox of a man so sick that his illnesses cancel each other out, leaving him in a state of terrible stasis that is somehow compatible with continued function. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome. The metaphor is three people trying to get through a doorway at once, jamming against each other, none of them able to make progress. But here is the thing that the joke obscures. Burns goes to doctors. Burns receives a diagnosis. Burns has a physician, presumably more than one, who is attending to his health with the kind of comprehensive, regular, attentive care that his resources make possible and his survival requires. And the doctor who gives Burns this diagnosis does not report it. The doctor who tells Burns that he has every disease known to medical science, that he is the sickest man in the United States, that he is being kept alive through a gridlock of competing pathologies, that doctor does not file a report with the CDC, does not flag Burns as a potential source of infectious disease, does not apparently raise any of the public health concerns that would, in any regulated medical context, be mandatory upon encountering a patient with this particular medical profile. Because Burns is the client. Because Burns pays for the care. Because the relationship between Burns and his physicians is the relationship between a man who can afford to purchase whatever he needs and the people who provide it. And what Burns needs his physicians to provide is not disclosure, it is management, discretion. The application of sophisticated medical resources to the problem of keeping one specific man alive, regardless of the implications for the people around him. This medical arrangement extends, the show implies, outward from Burns himself into the broader Springfield medical ecosystem, not through conspiracy, exactly, through the slow, pervasive influence of money and power and the consistent message sent through every transaction and donation and institution endowment that the arrangement benefits from not being examined too closely. And at the center of this unexamined arrangement, working in the facility that is the primary source of the town's medical problems, going to doctors who do not find what is in his brain, because what is in his brain is, in some ambient, unspoken way, better left there, is Homer Simpson. Homer has been a patient of the Springfield medical establishment for his entire life, and the medical establishment has served him in the way that it serves everyone in Springfield, which is to say, it has treated his symptoms without looking too hard at their causes. It has addressed his immediate presentations without following the causal chains back to the plant and to Burns and to the specific, identifiable origin of the damage. There is one more piece of the medical picture that deserves mention. The show establishes that Burns has a private pharmaceutical operation, a research division capable of synthesizing the experimental compounds Burns requires for his weekly treatments. These treatments, as we have discussed elsewhere, are what keep Burns alive. They manage the disease equilibrium that his body has arrived at through decades of radiation exposure. They prevent any single illness from gaining dominance. They are, in the show's own description, so advanced and so chemically intensive that they cause Burns's body to emit a visible green glow. Burns does not share these treatments. He does not make them available to the general population of Springfield, who are, by the radiation theory's logic, also experiencing elevated disease burden and elevated rates of the kinds of conditions that chronic radiation exposure produces. Burns's pharmaceutical resources are devoted entirely to Burns's survival, not to the survival of the community his plant has been poisoning for decades. This, too, is part of the arrangement. Burns knows what the radiation does to bodies. He knows because he is living inside a body that the radiation has done things to, and he has devoted enormous resources to managing those things in his own case. And he has chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to apply any of those resources to the cases of the people around him. The medical establishment of Springfield is not fighting for those people. The doctors are laughing. The physicians are managing their arrangements. The researchers are working on what they are funded to work on. And Homer Simpson, carrying a crayon and a lifetime of radiation and a grief that was constructed on a false premise, is going to his checkups and being told everything is fine. Everything has always been fine in Springfield. That is the diagnosis. That is the finding. Everything is fine. Bring him back in 6 months. Section 9. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie the inheritance. The damage does not stop with Homer. This is important. The story of Homer's cognitive limitation is not a story about a single man in a single generation. It is a story about what gets passed down. About the ways in which the conditions of a parent's life shape the conditions of their children's lives, not just through genetics, but through environment and psychology, and the specific flavor of brokenness that a family carries forward across time. Homer's children are growing up in Springfield. They are drinking the same water, breathing the same air, living under the same shadow of the same cracked cooling towers. And they are doing all of this with parents who have been shaped, each in their own specific way, by the damage we have been describing. Let us start with Bart. Bart Simpson is 10 years old and has been 10 years old for 36 years. He is the show's most elastic figure, capable of being a delinquent and a vulnerable child and a young entrepreneur and a loyal friend within the span of a single episode, depending on what the story requires. His intelligence is inconsistent in the way that intelligence is inconsistent in characters who were designed as comedy vehicles rather than psychological portraits. But the show has established, in specific and repeated ways, that Bart is not stupid. Bart is not stupid. This matters. Because the casual shorthand for the Simpson family, Homer is dumb, Bart is dumb, it runs in the family misrepresents what the show actually shows you. Bart is impulsive. He is easily bored. He has a specific relationship to authority, which is to say, no relationship to authority, or rather a relationship defined entirely by his instinct to test and transgress and see what happens when rules are bent far enough that they break. He does not perform well in conventional academic settings. He has been held back. He has failed tests. He has been told, by teachers and by systems designed to evaluate children, that he is underperforming. But impulsiveness is not the same as stupidity. Boredom with conventional academic formats is not the same as limited intelligence. The ability to quickly and accurately read social situations, to improvise solutions to practical problems, to maintain complex social relationships and navigate them strategically. These are all forms of intelligence that Bart displays consistently and that do not show up in grades or standardized tests. Bart is the product of Homer's chaos and Marge's anxiety and the specific environment of Springfield and the nuclear plant's ambient influence on a developing nervous system. He is also the product of Homer's warmth, which is the thing that keeps Bart, despite everything, from becoming something genuinely hard. Bart has a conscience. It is not well trained and it is not reliable, but it is there, and it comes from somewhere, and the somewhere is almost certainly Homer. Now Lisa. Lisa is the show's most fully realized portrait of what intelligence looks like in an environment that does not support it. She is brilliant. The show is consistent about this across all 36 seasons, more consistent about this than about almost anything else. She is a musician, a scholar, a moral philosopher in miniature, a person who cares about things with an intensity that would be admirable in any context, and is, in Springfield, a source of constant difficulty. And she is 8 years old. She has always been 8 years old. She will always be 8 years old, until the show ends. What does it do to a person, to an 8-year-old girl? Specifically to be the most intelligent person in her immediate environment and to receive no useful reflection of that intelligence back. To have a father who loves her but who, under the influence of the crayon and the plant and all the rest of it, cannot keep up with her? To have a mother who loves her but who sometimes finds Lisa's intensity exhausting because Marge is managing enough without also managing an 8-year-old whose moral concerns extend to the political structure of the country? To go to school in Springfield and to be so far ahead of the curriculum that school is less an education than a waiting room? Isolation. That is what it does. Lisa's intelligence is isolating in the specific way that intelligence is isolating when the intelligent person has not been given the social and emotional tools to translate their intelligence into human connection. Lisa is brilliant, and she is lonely, and she is 8 years old, and she has been lonely since she was born, in a family where nobody quite knows what to do with someone like her. Homer, to his credit, tries. He tries harder than anyone else in Lisa's life, with the possible exception of certain specific guest teachers and characters who appear for one episode and then disappear. But Homer's trying is limited by Homer's capacity, and Homer's capacity is limited by everything we have described. He sees Lisa, he loves Lisa, he cannot always follow Lisa. And the gap between seeing someone and being able to meet them where they are is, for Lisa, the central gap of her childhood. The post-crayon Homer closes that gap for 22 minutes. And then the crayon goes back in, and the gap opens again. And Lisa is 8 years old and alone with her intelligence in a house full of people who love her but who mostly cannot understand her. What does this do to her long-term development? The show answers this, in the flash-forward episodes, by showing you a Lisa who is always achieving and always isolated, always finding a slightly larger room that is still, somehow, not quite large enough for someone like her. Always searching for the one person who can see her the way her father could see her for 22 minutes when the crayon came out. Always, in some way, still waiting for him to wake up and be fully there. And Maggie. Maggie is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She does not speak. She communicates through pacifier sounds and pointed stares and the occasional dramatic act that reveals a capacity for planning and execution that is, in the context of a 1 year old, astonishing. The theory about Maggie, which deserves its own extended treatment somewhere, is that her silence is not developmental delay. It is strategy. It is the conclusion of a very intelligent person watching what happens to intelligent people who announce themselves as intelligent in the environment she was born into. Lisa announces her intelligence and gets nothing for it but isolation and resistance. Maggie watches this. Maggie learns from it. And Maggie decides, in the wordless way that very young and very intelligent children make decisions, that silence is better armor than speech. But what we want to focus on here is the inheritance. The specific things that each of Homer's children is inheriting from the conditions that produced Homer, they are all living in Springfield. They are all being exposed to whatever the plant is putting into the water and the air. They are all growing up in the gravitational field of Homer's damage, his fear of abandonment, his desperate need for approval, his specific brand of loving that is enormous and warm and slightly smothering, because it comes from a place of genuine terror that the people he loves will leave. Bart has Homer's impulsiveness amplified. He has Homer's warmth somewhat diluted, not gone, but less central to his presentation. He also has, and this is not something the show makes explicit, but is visible in the accumulation of episodes, Homer's specific relationship to authority. The authority that failed him, that could not see him, that dismissed him. Burns cannot remember Homer's name. Springfield's teachers and administrators cannot see Bart clearly. The parallel is not exact, but it rhymes. Lisa has something the show does not quite name, but that becomes visible if you look at it from this angle. She has inherited Mona's moral seriousness. Not from Mona directly, Lisa never meets Mona, but through Homer, who carries something of Mona in him even when he cannot access it, and through the specific genetics of a woman who was, in 1969, serious enough about her conscience to do something genuinely dangerous in service of it. Lisa's insistence that things be right, that injustice be named and resisted, that the comfortable lie be confronted even when confronting it costs something. This is Mona Simpson's inheritance, passed through Homer to a granddaughter Mona will never fully know. Maggie, as noted, has something that reads, under the radiation theory, as the opposite extreme of Homer's cognitive mutation. Where Homer's capacity was diminished, Maggie's appears to have been amplified. Same water, same air, same parents, same evergreen terrace. Different expression. The mutation runs in both directions. What all three children share is a father who loves them and who has been robbed. Who is giving them what he has, which is real and warm and genuine, but who was prevented from becoming the person who could have given them more? Who was robbed of his mother and his potential and 50 points of his IQ and 30 years of occupational health by a system that needed him to remain exactly as limited as he is? The children inherit the love. They also inherit the shape of the absence. They grow up in the space where a more complete Homer would have been. And that space, that specific negative space left by everything that was done to Homer before they were born, is part of what shapes them too. This is what inheritance means in the context we are examining. It is not just genes, it is environment and psychology, and the specific gravitational fields created by specific wounds in specific people. Homer's children are growing up inside the effects of what was done to Homer. And what was done to Homer was done, in large part, by the same force that continues to shape the environment they are growing up in. Burns at the center. Burns always. Section 10. Burns engineered this. We have been building toward this section for the entire video. Every earlier section has been a piece of it. The crayon, the plant, Mona, Abe, the deal, the medical establishment, the children. Each of these is a node in a network, and the network has a center, and the center is Charles Montgomery Burns. Let us be precise about what we are claiming. We are not claiming that Burns sat down one day and drew up a plan for Homer Simpson specifically. We are not claiming that Burns looked at a 6-year-old boy in 1969 and decided to spend the next several decades systematically destroying that child's cognitive capacity and emotional stability for the specific purpose of placing him in Sector 7G 3 decades later. What we are claiming is considerably more interesting than that. We are claiming that Burns built a system, a set of conditions and arrangements and maintained silences and structural incentives that produced, as their natural output, exactly the kind of worker Burns needed in exactly the position that worker needed to occupy, and that Homer Simpson, through the specific combination of circumstances that shaped his life, fit the requirements of that system perfectly. Not because Burns targeted Homer, because Homer was shaped by forces that Burns either created or controlled or benefited from in ways that made Homer's particular profile of damage not just possible but predictable. Let us trace the connections. Burns owns the nuclear plant. The plant leaks. The leaking has cognitive effects on the population, including the specific population of the plant's own workers. The plant's workers, including its safety inspector, are being made progressively less capable of understanding what is wrong with the plant by the process of working at the plant. This is a closed loop. The plant requires bad oversight to continue operating as profitably as it does. Bad oversight is produced in part by the plant itself. The plant is its own cover. Burns ran the biological weapons laboratory that Mona Simpson raided in 1969. Burns identified Mona and reported her to the FBI. Burns maintained his pursuit of Mona across decades, spotting her from a cab window in Season 7 and calling the authorities, forcing her to flee again. Burns's grudge against Mona kept Mona away from Springfield and away from Homer for 27 years. The specific maternal absence that shaped Homer's psychology, the terror of abandonment, the desperate need for approval, the inability to confront authority was created and maintained by Burns. Burns struck a deal with Abe Simpson that guaranteed Homer's employment at the plant. The deal was Burns's response to Abe having dangerous knowledge. By converting Abe's dangerous knowledge into a guarantee of Homer's employment, Burns did several things simultaneously. He secured Abe's silence. He placed Homer in the optimal position for continued cognitive decline. He created a situation in which the Simpson family had a vested financial interest in the plant's continued operation, making it considerably harder for them to challenge the plant's practices. And he took Abe's leverage, the dangerous knowledge, and transformed it into a leash. The deal is not a deal between equals. It is a deal between a man with enormous resources and institutional power and a man with nothing but information, who parlays that information into the best thing he can get for his son, which is a job. And the job turns out to be the thing that ensures Homer will never become the person who might otherwise challenge Burns. This is the architecture of the engineering. It does not require Burns to have anticipated Homer specifically. It requires Burns to have built a system for his own benefit, for the protection of his interests and his empire and his extended lifespan that naturally selects for the kind of person Homer became. The system rewards compliance. It rewards people who do not ask questions. It rewards cognitive limitation, because cognitively limited workers do not notice safety violations, do not organize around shared grievances, do not file reports with external regulatory agencies, do not become whistleblowers. Homer fits the system because the system was built by the same person who created the conditions that produced Homer. Burns did not target Homer. Burns built a world, and Homer was shaped by that world into exactly the thing that world needed. There is a philosophical concept sometimes called structural violence. It describes the ways in which social structures and institutions inflict harm on individuals not through direct physical violence, but through the systematic shaping of conditions, economic conditions, environmental conditions, Institutional conditions that limit people's ability to develop their full capacities and live according to their full potential. Structural violence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It works slowly and systemically and produces outcomes that look, from the outside, like individual failures rather than systemic ones. Homer looks like an individual failure. That is the punchline of the show's premise. He is the bumbling idiot in Sector 7G, funny to watch, familiar enough to love, too limited to take seriously as anything other than a comic figure. The individual failure explanation is the one everyone accepts. Homer is not very smart. Homer is clumsy and forgetful and barely functional. Homer is, as his own creator stated, a man with an IQ of 55. But the structural violence explanation which the show has been building throughout its run, without ever fully naming it, says something different. Homer is not an individual failure. Homer is the predictable product of a set of structural conditions that were created and maintained by the most powerful entity in his world. The crayon in isolation looks like an accident. The radiation in isolation looks like an unfortunate side effect of industrial development. The maternal loss in isolation looks like personal tragedy. The deal in isolation looks like an old man trying to provide for his son. Taken together, they are the portrait of a man who was systematically reduced, not targeted, not specifically singled out for destruction, reduced by the general operation of a system that required people like Homer in order to function, and the person who built the system, who benefits from the system, who maintains the system through the weekly radiation treatments that keep him alive, and the pharmaceutical resources that keep his diseases in balance, and the institutional influence that keeps anyone from looking too closely at what his plant is doing to the people downwind, that person is Burns. Burns is not a villain in the mustache-twirling sense. He is something more interesting and more alarming, a system operator. A man who has built something so large and so self-sustaining that it does not require his active attention to continue producing the outcomes he benefits from. The plant runs, the water stays contaminated, the medical establishment stays accommodating, the political establishment stays purchased, the safety inspector stays in his seat. And Burns, if he thinks about any of this at all, thinks about it with the satisfied detachment of a man who built something that works. Homer has met Burns. They have had conversations well, Homer has attempted conversations, and Burns has responded to those attempts with the gracious dismissiveness of a man who does not need to remember Homer's name, because Homer's name is not relevant to any decision Burns needs to make. Homer has, in specific episodes, been placed in Burns's presence in ways that give him the opportunity to see the connection between Burns and his own history. He never sees it, not fully. The crayon is in the way, the radiation is in the way. The childhood loss and the emotional architecture it produced, and the decades of exposure to an environment that has been quietly eroding his cognitive capacity since before he was born, all of it is in the way. Homer sits across from the man who drove his mother away and cannot make the connection. Homer works for the man who destroyed his family and cannot see what he is working for. Homer lives on the electricity produced by the facility that has been poisoning his water and his brain and his children's developing nervous systems and finds it, in the moments when he thinks about it at all, simply unremarkable. The plant is there. The cooling towers are there. The glow of the reactor is visible through the window of the break room where Homer eats his donuts, and Homer does not see it as anything other than the background of his life. Because the background of his life was designed to be invisible to him, that is the engineering. That is what Burns built, not Homer specifically, the invisibility. The capacity of the system to operate in full view of the people it is harming, while those people lack the cognitive and emotional resources to recognize what they are looking at. Homer is the clearest example of this, but he is not the only one. Springfield is full of people in Homer's position, people whose capacity to question the world they are living in has been reduced by the world they are living in. People who live downstream of the plant and have three-eyed fish in their river and yellow skin in their families, and a billionaire employer who cannot remember their names and who nonetheless keep showing up to work and watching television and being briefly alarmed by things they quickly forget, because forgetting is what the system has trained them to do. Homer is the sharpest focus of this pattern. He is the example the show chose to make its central character, because Homer, up close, every episode, is the most sustained examination the show offers of what structural violence looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not visible to the person experiencing it, just the slow, persistent, compound damage of a life lived inside a system that needed you to be smaller than you are. Burns engineered the conditions. The conditions produced Homer. And Homer, in Sector 7G, falling asleep in front of the reactor console, is the most successful thing Burns has ever built. Section 11. The floating timeline. As Homer's trap, nobody in Springfield ages. We have said this before. It is the most visible and most discussed feature of the show's structure, the thing that most obviously marks it as a construction rather than a realistic portrait, the thing that everyone accepts as a condition of watching a long-running animated series without looking too hard at what it might mean within the internal logic of the world the show has built. But we have been looking hard at the internal logic of the world the show has built, and when you look hard at it, the floating timeline is not just a production convenience. It is the logical extension of everything else the show has been telling you. Nobody ages in Springfield. The children are always the ages they were at the start. Homer and Marge are always in their mid-30s. Burns is always impossibly ancient. The town cycles through catastrophes and resets, and the characters return each week to exactly the positions they occupied before the catastrophe happened. Nothing accumulates. Nothing develops. The story, for all its episodic momentum, does not actually go anywhere. This is the narrative expression of the structural trap we have been describing. Think about it this way. The damage we have been cataloging, the crayon, the radiation, the maternal loss, the deal, the plant, the medical establishment's complicit inattention, all of it has produced a Homer Simpson who is, in a specific and tragic sense, frozen. Not physiologically frozen. Homer's body changes across the show. In some episodes, he has gained or lost weight, the animation has evolved, the details of his appearance shift slightly. But psychologically, Homer is frozen. He is the 6-year-old who woke up and found his mother gone. He is the man who went back into the fog because being smart was too painful. He is the worker who falls asleep in front of the reactor because nothing he has ever learned has given him a compelling reason to stay awake. The floating timeline is the show's formal acknowledgement that Homer is trapped, that the whole town is trapped, that the loop is not an error in the show's structure but a representation of its subject matter. Springfield goes around and around because Springfield was built to go around and around. Because the system that Burns created, and that Burns's predecessors and predecessors' predecessors created, was designed to prevent exactly the kind of accumulation that makes change possible. Accumulation of knowledge, accumulation of grievance, accumulation of the specific kind of awareness that leads a population to look at their situation clearly and decide that it needs to be different. The radiation prevents accumulation of knowledge, in the specific sense of making it harder for the population to retain and connect information. The collective denial which the Principal and the Pauper episode documents with uncomfortable precision prevents accumulation of grievance by ensuring that each catastrophe is forgotten before it can compound with the previous catastrophe into something that demands a response. The deal prevents the specific accumulation of the Simpson family, prevents Homer from becoming more than Burns's system, requires him to be by ensuring that Homer's employment is permanent and his position is fixed, and the conditions of his working life remain continuous. Nothing accumulates. The timeline floats. And Homer is 37 years old, or thereabouts, for the entire run of the show, which is to say that Homer is exactly as old as he needs to be to remain in Sector 7G indefinitely. Now consider what aging would mean in Homer's specific case. An aging Homer is a Homer who has, potentially, had more time to accumulate the things the system is trying to prevent him from accumulating. More time to see the pattern. More time, perhaps, to encounter people or information or experiences that begin to fill in the picture that has been obscured since his childhood. An older Homer might have made the connection between Burns and his mother. An older Homer might have, with enough accumulated experience, developed the psychological stability to confront the authority he has spent his whole life appeasing. The floating timeline prevents this. Homer stays 37. He stays in the position where the system has placed him. He stays in the loop. This is Homer's trap at the level of the show's own structure. The same force that operates within the narrative, the force that keeps Homer in Sector 7G and keeps the plant running and keeps Springfield unable to address its own contamination, operates at the level of the narrative's form. The show cannot allow Homer to age because aging would allow Homer to escape. And the show cannot allow Homer to escape because the whole show is, in some sense, the portrait of his trap. Lisa, in the flash-forward episodes, ages. The show gives you a glimpse of who she becomes. A 23-year-old woman, then older, always brilliant, and always searching for connection. And then the show takes it back. Lisa returns to 8 years old. The flash-forward closes. The permanent present resumes. Lisa's aging is possible to imagine because Lisa, of all the Simpsons, has the fewest forces actively working to keep her small. She is brilliant, and nobody is invested in suppressing her brilliance in the specific, systemic way that Homer's has been suppressed. She is not in Sector 7G. She is not in the deal. She is the granddaughter of Mona Simpson and the inheritor of whatever survived the damage, which is something worth having. But even Lisa returns to 8. Even the one character who most clearly escapes the gravitational field of the trap is pulled back into the permanent present. Because the show, whatever else it is also about a specific kind of American stasis. About the family that cannot change because changing is what happens when people can afford to change, which Springfield's people cannot. Because the system that Burns built is not designed to afford anyone the resources to change. The floating timeline, examined this way, is not a lazy production choice. It is the show's most honest, formal statement. It says, these people are not going anywhere. They cannot go anywhere. The trap is too well built. The conditions that produce the trap are too deeply embedded in the structure of the world they live in. And the trap will keep running, and the show will keep running, and Homer will keep falling asleep in front of the reactor for as long as the system that Burns built holds. Which, if the Burns immortality arc is to be believed, might be a very long time indeed. There is something else the floating timeline does that deserves mention. It prevents Homer from understanding his own history in a cumulative way, because memory, in the real world, works through accumulation. We understand patterns by living through enough examples of the pattern to recognize it. We see what is being done to us by accumulating enough instances of it happening to recognize the consistency. We grow by being old enough to look back at the arc of what has happened and draw conclusions. Homer cannot do this, not just because of the crayon, not just because of the radiation, though those things make it harder. He cannot do this because the floating timeline resets the accumulation. Each season, Homer starts more or less where he was. The lessons of previous seasons do not compound. The specific moments of clarity that Homer achieves, the post-crayon Homer, the Homer who holds his mother's hand while she dies, the Homer who watches Lisa play saxophone at a school recital and feels something complicated and specific and entirely deserved. These moments do not sediment into a Homer who is progressively more aware of himself and his situation. They flash. And then they are gone. And Homer goes back to the console. The trap is formal. The trap is structural. The trap is the floating timeline, and the floating timeline is the trap, and both of them are the show's most sophisticated statement about what it feels like to be Homer Simpson. It feels like going around the same loop, forever, with moments of clarity that never quite last long enough to change anything. It feels like being 37 years old for 36 years. It feels like falling asleep in front of a reactor that you have never been given adequate reason to stay awake for. It feels, in the end, like Springfield. Section 12. Why we need Homer to stay stupid. Here is the final question, and it is the one that brings all of the others back around to something that is not just about a cartoon, but about us. Why do we need Homer to stay stupid? Not Burns, not the system, not Springfield's medical establishment or its political establishment or its culture of collective denial. Us, the audience. The people who have been watching this show for 36 years, who have returned every week to Evergreen Terrace, who know Homer's voice and Homer's laugh and Homer's specific, beloved, infuriating way of being in the world, as well as we know most of the real people in our lives. Why do we need him to stay the way he is? The answer starts with something simple. Homer, the way he is one of the great comic characters in the history of American television. He is funny in a way that does not diminish with repetition. His reactions, his exclamations, his relationship to food and drink, and the simple pleasures of a life he does not particularly examine these things are funny because they are recognizable. Because we have all been Homer in some moment. All of us have wanted the donut badly enough to ignore the warning light. All of us have fallen asleep when we should have been paying attention. All of us have loved people with a desperate, slightly embarrassing intensity that was not quite proportionate to the situation. Homer is recognizable. That is why we come back. Not to observe him from a safe, intellectual distance, not to feel superior to him, though the show occasionally invites this and occasionally resists it, but to see ourselves in him, in the gap between who we are and who we might be, in the love that is real and enormous and sometimes expressed so clumsily that it is hard to receive, in the persistence that is not strategic and not dignified, and is the persistence of someone who does not have the luxury of giving up. But there is something else, something less comfortable. Homer, at 105 IQ, is a problem. We have established this. He is a problem for Burns, and for the plant, and for the system that requires his continued presence in Sector 7G without too many questions. But he is also, in a subtler way, a problem for the audience. Because the smarter Homer, the 22-minute post-crayon Homer, is a Homer who sees Springfield clearly, who sees the plant and understands what it is doing, who sees his family and understands what it has cost them, who sees himself and begins to understand the architecture of his own damage. That Homer is not funny. He is moving, and he is honest, and he is, in the episode that depicts him, one of the most interesting versions of this character the show has ever produced. But he is not the Homer we come back to every week. Because the Homer we come back to every week is the one who does not see it, who falls asleep before the seeing can happen, who chooses the fog over the clarity, partly because clarity is painful and partly because the fog is warm and familiar, and the people Homer loves are in the fog with him. We need Homer to stay stupid because Homer Smart requires us to look at what was done to him. And looking at what was done to him requires us to look at the system that did it. And looking at the system that did it requires us to think about the systems around us, the plants we live downwind of, the bosses who cannot remember our names, the deals that were made before we were born that determine what kind of life is available to us and what kind of awareness we are allowed to develop. That is not the function we want Homer to serve. We want Homer to be the guy on the couch. The guy who loves his family and eats his donuts and stumbles through the world with his enormous, specific, slightly embarrassing love intact no matter how many times the world gives him reason to close it off. We want Homer to be indestructible, not in the sense of the radiation theory's mutated biology, but in the sense of the emotional core that survives everything. The love that cannot be eroded by a crayon or 30 years of reactor fumes or a childhood defined by absence. We want that Homer to stay, and we want him to stay the way he is because the way he is, the damaged, warm, stumbling, forgetful Homer of 36 seasons, is the version that most closely resembles the thing we recognize in ourselves. We are all, in some measure, operating below our own capacity. We are all carrying some version of the crayon, some early wound, some environmental factor, some deal that was made before we were old enough to object, some system we inhabit without fully understanding what it is doing to us. We are all Homer, more than we are Lisa or Marge or Burns. Homer is the character whose shape fits the universal human experience of being somewhat less than you might have been in slightly different circumstances. And we do not want to look at what made him that way, because looking at what made him that way means looking at what made us this way. And the answer to that question is rarely as comfortable as we would like it to be. So we keep watching. We keep coming back to Evergreen Terrace. We keep laughing at the donut and the sleeping, and the spectacular failures of a man who has never stopped trying, who has never once, in 36 years, given up on the people he loves. We keep needing Homer to be Homer, and we keep calling it comedy, and we keep not quite looking at the system that produced him, because the system that produced Homer is a system we recognize, and recognizing it would require something of us that we are not entirely sure we are prepared to give. But here, in this long, slow dark, in the hours of a night that is not asking you to do anything or be anything or recognize anything beyond the warmth of being still here, you can let yourself see it. Homer Simpson is not stupid because he was born that way. Homer Simpson is the product of a crayon that went unremoved for decades. and a plant that leaked its way into his brain tissue and his bloodstream, and a mother who was driven away when he was 6 years old by a man who has never faced a consequence for anything he has done, and a father who told a lie to protect his son and ended up entrenching the damage, and a deal that placed Homer in the optimal position for the system's continued operation, and a medical establishment that found it professionally comfortable not to look too closely, and a floating timeline that prevents the accumulation of awareness that might otherwise produce change. He is the product of all of this. And he is, despite all of this, someone who goes home every evening to Evergreen Terrace and sits on the couch with his family and loves them with everything he has, which is considerable, and which no system has ever managed to take away. That is what Homer is without the joke. That is what Homer is when you follow the threads all the way back. A man who was robbed, and who kept showing up anyway, and who loves his people the way you love people when love is the one thing that was never taken from you, when it was the thing that survived everything. When it is, at the end of every episode and at the end of every season, and at the end of 36 years of jokes and pratfalls and meltdown warnings and donuts thrown into reactor cores, when it is the only thing left standing in the wreckage of everything else. Homer Simpson is not stupid. Homer Simpson is what happens to a person who was never given the conditions to be anything other than what he is, and who decided, somewhere underneath all the damage, to love his family anyway. That is the real story. That has always been the real story, and now you know it. Sleep well. The cooling towers are quiet tonight. Evergreen Terrace is still. The reactor hums at its steady frequency somewhere in the dark, and Homer is at home, asleep on the couch, and the family is around him. And in this specific moment, this moment between one episode ending and the next one beginning, in the permanent present of Springfield's floating timeline, everything is as it always is. Everything is as it always will be, and maybe that is enough. Maybe the loop, as a place to rest, is exactly what it needs to be. Good night. If this video kept you company tonight, leave us a comment, tell us what time it is, and where in the world you are. We read everyone. And if you want more long-form stories like this one, subscribe. We will be here when you come back. Springfield always is. End of script. Extended section. The full weight of Homer's damage. A deeper examination. We have traced the major outlines of what happened to Homer Simpson. The crayon, the plant, the loss of his mother, the lie his father told, the deal that was made, the medical establishment that did not look, the children who inherited the shape of the damage. But outlines are not the same as depth, and Homer's story deserves depth. It deserves the kind of sustained, unhurried attention that the show's own comedic pacing has never been able to fully provide, because comedy, by its nature, has to keep moving. Comedy cannot sit with the full weight of a thing. It can point at the thing and make you laugh at the point, and sometimes the laughter is a way of feeling the thing in a compressed and survivable form. But it cannot hold still long enough for you to feel the full shape of what you are looking at. We are going to hold still now. Let us begin with Homer at 6 years old. Not the Homer of the show, who is always 37, who is always the man already formed, already the person the damage made him. The Homer of 1969. The Homer who has been alive for 6 years in a family that, for all its specific limitations, has been a family. His mother is there, his father is there, he goes to school. He has the ordinary life of a 6-year-old in a small American town in the late 1960s. The routine, the boredom, the small dramas of childhood friendship and schoolyard hierarchy, the warm ground of a home that is intact. And then the ground shifts. Children do not understand loss the way adults understand it. Adults have context. Adults have language for grief, rituals of mourning, the support structures of communities that recognize the form of what is happening and know what to offer. Adults have the cognitive capacity to hold the loss as a separate thing, to locate it outside themselves, to understand that what happened is a thing that happened in the world and not a thing that happened inside them. Children do not have these things. A child's loss lands differently. It lands as a fact about the world that cannot be distinguished from a fact about the child. If a parent leaves, the child's nervous system does not process this as an event that occurred independently of the child's own value. It processes it as evidence about the child, about whether the child is the kind of being that is worth staying for. Homer was not told. Your mother had to go for reasons that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with a man named Burns, who made terrible choices and who had the power to make them stick. Homer was told, "Your mother is dead, she died, she is gone, there is a grave." A grave is supposed to be an answer. It is supposed to say, the question of why she left is resolved. She did not choose to go, she was taken. Her leaving is not a verdict on you. But a 6-year-old's nervous system is not sophisticated enough to fully receive that reassurance. Even with the grave, even with the story of death rather than choice, the absence is there. The presence that was there is now absent. And absence, for a child who is still learning the basic grammar of how the world works, registers as something that happened to them rather than something that happened around them. Homer grew up inside that registration, inside the low hum of a loss that was explained as death, but that felt, at the level below explanation, like something more personal, something about him, something that meant he was the kind of person whose mother leaves. And Abe was there. Abe was present. Abe drove Homer to school and made Homer's breakfasts and attended Homer's events with the specific, limited, materially expressed love that was Abe's entire repertoire of loving. But Abe was also always slightly elsewhere, always partially occupied by the thing he was not saying. The lie required a portion of Abe's cognitive and emotional attention just to maintain, and that portion was unavailable for actual presence with Homer. Children feel this too. They feel the quality of an adult's attention in ways they cannot articulate but cannot miss. Homer felt that his father was there, and also not quite there. That there was something between them that he could not see but that was always in the way. Something Abe was managing that made full presence with Homer not quite possible. This combination, the loss of his mother explained as death, the presence of his father experienced as slightly unavailable, is the combination that produces the specific emotional architecture we see in Homer as an adult. The desperate need for connection, the terror of abandonment, the willingness to do almost anything to maintain the approval of the people he loves rather than risk even the smallest conflict that might produce distance. Homer is, at the level of his attachment history, a person who has been living in a state of low-level emergency since he was 6 years old. Not the acute immediate emergency of a person in immediate danger, the chronic low-level emergency of a nervous system that learned early that the ground can shift without warning, that the person you depend on most can be gone when you wake up, that safety is not guaranteed and must be continuously earned or at minimum continuously maintained through whatever behaviors seem most likely to preserve it. This kind of chronic emotional emergency does not show up in obvious ways. It shows up as personality. As Homer's personality, specifically, the warmth, the persistence, the inability to let conflict accumulate without resolving it, the compulsive generosity, the willingness to absorb insults and humiliations that a person with a more secure attachment history would simply refuse. Homer absorbs these things not because he is pathologically passive, but because, at some level below his conscious awareness, the alternative, pushing back, risking the rejection that pushback might produce, is more frightening than whatever he is being asked to absorb. Now layer on the crayon. The crayon has been in place since Homer was a child, pressing on the frontal lobe systems that govern exactly the kind of higher-order cognitive processing that might otherwise allow Homer to examine these patterns. The ability to reflect on one's own behavior and understand it in terms of its causes, the ability to recognize patterns across different situations and draw conclusions from the pattern, the ability to plan a course of action that serves one's actual interests rather than simply responding to the immediate emotional demand of the situation. All of this, the self-reflective, pattern-recognizing, long-range planning capacity of the frontal lobe is operating below optimal efficiency in Homer from childhood, not absent. Homer can do these things. He does them imperfectly, inconsistently, under the influence of the frontal lobe pressure that the crayon produces. He can see a pattern sometimes and miss it other times. He can plan when the stakes are high enough, and he cannot plan when they are not. He has moments of clarity, and he has the longer stretches of fog. And in the fog, the emotional architecture of the 6-year-old who lost his mother runs the show. Because emotional patterns, unlike intellectual patterns, do not require frontal lobe mediation to operate. They run deeper than that. They run at the level of the nervous system's most basic regulatory processes. They are Homer's operating system. the default mode that takes over when the higher cognitive functions are not available to direct traffic. Homer's operating system is keep the people close, avoid conflict, tolerate discomfort rather than risk the relationship, show up even when showing up is painful, love persistently and without conditions, and without asking for proportional return. This is not a bad operating system. In many contexts, it is a beautiful one. It is the operating system of the father who shows up to every school play even when the school play is interminable, of the husband who notices that Marge is stressed before Marge has said anything, of the man who comes home from a day at the worst job in Springfield history and genuinely, sincerely delights in the warmth of the house he comes home to. The operating system is not the damage. The operating system is what survived the damage. The operating system is Homer. But the operating system, running without the correction that fully functional executive capacity would provide, produces behaviors that make Homer vulnerable to exactly the kind of ongoing exploitation that the system around him is designed to deliver. The willingness to stay in a terrible job because conflict is too frightening. The inability to recognize the pattern of his employer, never remembering his name as evidence that the relationship is organized around his employer's benefit rather than his own. The tolerance for conditions that a person with more secure attachment and more functional frontal lobe processing would not tolerate. Homer stays in Sector 7G. Homer does not quit. Homer does not confront Burns. Homer does not report the violations to external authorities, even when the crayon is briefly removed and he writes the report and has the clarity to understand what the report means. He writes the report and he files the report, and then he chooses the fog. The choosing of the fog is the moment where the emotional operating system and the damaged frontal lobe and the childhood loss and the plant's ongoing effects all converge into a single decision. Being smart in Springfield is too painful, Homer says. And he is not wrong. The evidence is there. But the specific quality of the pain that being smart produces, the isolation, the exclusion, the experience of being the person who sees things that nobody else wants to see is pain that runs along exactly the nerve that the childhood loss made most sensitive. It is the pain of being the person who does not belong, the person who has to stand outside the comfortable consensus because they can see something the consensus is organized around not seeing. That specific pain is the pain Homer has been most afraid of since he was 6 years old, and the ground shifted and the person he most depended on was gone. He cannot sit inside that pain. The operating system will not allow it. The operating system says, the cost of belonging is the fog. Pay it, he pays it. The crayon goes back in. The fog descends. And Homer goes to work on Monday morning and falls asleep in front of the reactor, and the loop continues. Now let us look at what the plant is adding to this picture on a daily basis, because the daily accumulation matters and it tends to be underestimated when we focus on the dramatic moments, the crayon episode, the mother's return, the season finales. The daily accumulation is the quieter and in some ways more significant story. Homer wakes up in the morning, he eats breakfast, he gets in the car, he drives to the plant. These are the ordinary actions of an ordinary workday for any of the millions of people who begin their days with some version of this routine. For most of those millions of people, the drive is the most dangerous part. The commute, with its statistical risk of traffic accidents, is the primary hazard of the ordinary morning. For Homer, the destination is the hazard. He drives toward the thing that is doing damage, not away from it. The Springfield nuclear power plant in the morning is a specific environment. It has a smell. The show references this occasionally, the specific smell of a nuclear facility that is not quite meeting its containment standards. It has a sound. It has a temperature regulated by systems that are themselves subject to the plant's general maintenance practices. It has an ambient radiation level that is, by the evidence of the safety violations and the river fish and the community health outcomes, above what it should be. Homer spends 8 hours in this environment, every working day, every year, 30 years. The cumulative measurement of this exposure, the total dose absorbed over 30 years of daily 8-hour shifts in a facility with 342 safety violations, is not something the show calculates because the show does not operate in the register of occupational health statistics. But if you were to calculate it, drawing on what we know about the plant's violation profile and what we know about radiation exposure standards, and what we know about the documented effects of chronic occupational radiation exposure on the workers who experience it, the number would be significant, not the number of an acute exposure event. Homer has not had a single massive dose that would produce immediate and dramatic radiation sickness. He has had the quieter and more insidious thing: 30 years of daily accumulation, 30 years of the specific, low-grade, chronic damage that produces not dramatic symptoms but gradual, nearly invisible reduction in function across multiple systems. The cognitive system, the immune system, the endocrine system, which regulates the hormones that in turn regulate everything from mood to metabolism to the body's capacity to manage stress. All of these systems experience degradation under chronic radiation exposure. All of these degradations are, in Homer's specific case, compounding the existing damage from the crayon, from the childhood loss, from the environmental exposure of growing up in Springfield. The compounding is the key point. Each source of damage lowers the threshold for the damage produced by every other source. A brain that is already operating under frontal lobe pressure is less able to defend itself against radiation-induced neurological damage. A nervous system that is already running in chronic low-level emergency mode is less able to manage the additional allostatic load that occupational stress produces. A person who is already emotionally isolated by the specific psychological patterns produced by early loss is less able to access the social support that buffers against the cognitive effects of chronic stress. Homer is carrying all of this simultaneously. He has been carrying all of it since before he understood that there was anything to carry. And he carries it with the warmth and the persistence and the genuine love that are his most enduring qualities, showing up every morning to the plant and every evening to Evergreen Terrace, finding in the warmth of the house at the end of the day the one thing that makes the day survivable: his family. His irreducible, specific, beloved family. That love does not fix the damage. Nothing about Homer's love for his family addresses the crayon or the radiation or the childhood wound or the deal. But it is the thing that makes sense of all the rest of it. It is why Homer tolerates the intolerable. It is why Homer stays in the fog when the clarity is too painful. It is why Homer keeps showing up to the plant and to Evergreen Terrace, despite everything. Not because the system trapped him, because the people he loves are inside the trap. Because leaving the trap, which would mean challenging Burns and the plant and the deal and the entire institutional arrangement that keeps Springfield the way Springfield is, would risk the family along with everything else. And the family is what Homer has always been most afraid to lose. Burns did not just trap Homer in a job. Burns built a situation in which Homer's deepest, most fundamental motivation, the love for his family that survived everything that the damage never reached, would keep Homer inside the trap voluntarily. Homer does not need to be forced to stay. Homer wants to stay because his family is where he stays. And his family is in Springfield, and Springfield is the plant, and the plant is Burns. The trap runs on Homer's own love. That is perhaps the darkest thing about it. The thing that should have been his way out, the love, the persistence, the warmth that no amount of damage extinguished, is precisely the thing that keeps him inside. This is the full weight of Homer's damage. Not the crayon alone, not the plant alone, not the childhood loss alone, the totality of it. The specific combination that produced a man who is limited in exactly the ways the system needed him to be limited, trapped in exactly the ways the system needed him to be trapped, and held inside the trap by the only thing in his life that the system never managed to damage: his love. It is the most moving and the most terrible thing about Homer Simpson. Extended section: the world Homer was promised and never received. There is a version of this story that could have been different, not in the sense of a fantasy or a counterfactual that consoles. In the sense of a genuine alternative that the show glimpses in specific episodes, that tells you what the full, uncompromised version of Homer's life might have looked like if the conditions that produced the damaged version had not been in place. The show offers you this alternative in moments. Not episode's one episode, the crayon episode, comes closest to a sustained look, but moments, glimpses, fragments of a Homer who exists below the fog, accessible in specific circumstances when the right conditions are met. The moment when Homer holds Maggie for the first time after her birth, and the quality of his attention, the specific, focused, fully present attention of a person who is completely in the moment, is visible in a way that the ordinary Homer rarely achieves. The moment when Homer sits with his father on the front steps at the end of an episode, and the warmth between them is real and uncomplicated in a way that most of Homer's emotional life is not. The moment when Homer finds out his mother is alive, and the emotion on his face is not the broad, performed emotion of a cartoon character, but something quieter and more specific and more true. In these moments, you see the Homer who exists below the damage. The Homer who was not given the conditions to be fully himself, but who surfaces in the spaces between the joke and the next scene, in the pause before the cut. He is there. He has always been there. Now, let us imagine the conditions that would have allowed that Homer to be the primary Homer rather than the glimpsed one. Mona stays. She does not go on the raid in 1969. Or she goes on the raid, but Burns does not see her face. Or Burns sees her face and reports her, but the FBI does not find her, and the case goes cold, and she comes home after 6 months, and Homer wakes up in the morning and she is there. She stays. Homer grows up with both parents. Abe is still limited, still emotionally unavailable in the specific ways that his generation and his background made him. But Mona is there, providing the warmth and the engagement and the full attention love that Abe cannot provide. Homer has both. He has the provision and the presence. He has the stable ground. The crayon comes out. Mona takes Homer to the doctor because she is the kind of mother who takes her child to the doctor when something seems off, and something is off. Homer's behavior changed slightly after that afternoon with the crayons, and Mona noticed because Mona pays the kind of attention that noticing requires. The doctor finds the crayon. It comes out. Homer's frontal lobe develops without the pressure. The executive function develops normally. Homer's attachment history is intact. He has not experienced the foundational loss that produced the desperate need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the inability to confront authority. He has the ordinary, functional attachment security of a person who was loved consistently and whose loved ones remained. He can disagree with people without it feeling like the end of everything. He can draw a hard line without losing himself in the terror of what the hard line might cost. And Homer grows up. He attends Springfield schools, which are inadequate, but an intact frontal lobe gives him the capacity to learn despite the inadequacy of the environment. He is not a genius. The show does not suggest that Homer's undamaged baseline would be exceptional, and we are not trying to make him exceptional here. He is a person of normal adult intelligence, with normal adult capacity for planning and judgment and consequence assessment. He still has the warmth, the love, the capacity for connection, the specific Homerness that is his irreducible quality. He is funny in a way that comes from genuine wit rather than from the impulsive, fog-navigating humor of the damaged Homer. He is warm in a way that does not need to be performed or maintained through constant effort because it is the natural expression of someone who is not running in chronic emotional emergency. He looks for work. The Springfield nuclear power plant is the largest employer in town, and he might well end up there. Even in this version of the story, the plant dominates the local economy, and it is not unreasonable for a young man from Springfield to end up working there. But he does not end up there as a result of a deal. He ends up there as a result of a legitimate application process. And the role he is placed in is matched to his actual skills rather than to the system's need for a specific kind of incompetence in a specific position. He is not the safety inspector. Or if he is the safety inspector, he is the safety inspector in the way the role was intended to function, as someone who actually inspects, who actually finds things, who actually reports what he finds, and follows up when the reports are not acted on. He does not fall asleep at the console. He does not ignore the warning lights. He does not throw objects into the reactor to see what happens. And because he is doing his job properly, the plant runs differently. Not because Homer alone can fix 30 years of institutional neglect and Burns's deliberate maintenance of an unsafe facility, but because a functioning safety inspector is a different actor in the system than a non-functioning one. A functioning safety inspector creates records, creates reports, creates a paper trail that, over time, creates legal exposure for the people responsible for the violations the inspector is documenting. Creates the kind of accountability that Burns has spent decades purchasing the absence of. A functioning safety inspector, over time, becomes a problem for Burns. And here, in the world Homer was promised and never received, we see the reason that Burns, whether deliberately or through the self-organizing logic of the system he built, needed Homer to be the specific kind of safety inspector Homer became. Not just ineffective, specifically ineffective in ways that could be attributed to Homer's own limitations, rather than to the plant's deliberate creation of conditions that guarantee ineffective oversight. Homer is not the safety inspector who failed. Homer is the safety inspector who was positioned to fail. Who was placed in the role? Because the role required someone who would fail in the specific ways Homer was guaranteed to fail, and who would provide the explanation his own limitations for that failure. The world Homer was promised would not have provided this. The world Homer was promised would have produced a Homer who was, from Burns's perspective, a liability rather than an asset. A Homer who shows up and does his job is a Homer who threatens the plant's continued operation in its current form. And the plant's continued operation in its current form is the foundation of everything Burns has built. This is why the world Homer was promised could not, within the logic of Burns's system, be allowed to exist. Not because Burns targeted Homer specifically, because the conditions Burns needed to maintain the system were incompatible with the conditions that would have allowed Homer to develop into his full capacity. The system required a Homer who was limited, and the conditions of Springfield, the plant's environmental contamination, the absence of Mona, Abe's lie, the deal reliably produced a limited Homer. Not reliably in the sense of certainty. The world is not deterministic in that way. Homer, under different circumstances, might still have been challenged. Might still have faced setbacks that produced some of the patterns we see in him. The counterfactual is not a guarantee. It is an alternative, a possibility. The shape of what might have been, but the shape of what might have been is part of the story of what is. Because the gap between the Homer who might have been and the Homer who is the gap between the post-Crayon Homer at 105 and the undamaged Homer at whatever he would have been, and between both of those and the Homer who falls asleep in Sector 7G, that gap is the measure of what was taken, of what the system cost, of what Burns's world did to the person Homer was supposed to become. The world Homer was promised looked like a house with both parents in it, a frontal lobe developing without obstruction, an attachment history that provided the secure base from which people are able to take the risks that growth requires, a job that matched his actual capacity, a relationship with his employer that was professional and mutual, rather than the relationship of a man who depends on his captor for everything and cannot afford to recognize the captivity for what it is. That world was taken from Homer before he was old enough to know it was his. It was taken piece by piece, through the specific mechanisms we have been describing, by the specific operations of a system that needed Homer to be less than he was. And what remained after the taking was the warmth, the love. The Homer who keeps showing up. That Homer is real. He is not a consolation prize for the Homer who never got built. He is the thing that survived. He is the thing worth holding on to. The love that no system managed to damage. The warmth that persists through every episode and every season, and every 36 years of the loop. Homer did not get the world he was promised. But the person he is, the person underneath the joke, underneath the damage, underneath the crayon and the radiation, and the childhood loss, that person is worth knowing. That is what this video has been about. Knowing that person. Seeing him. Not as the punchline, but as the point. Homer Simpson. The most complete portrait of what structural damage does to a human being in the history of American comedy. And also the most complete portrait of what survives structural damage. Of what no amount of systemic reduction can fully reach. The warmth, the love, the persistence, the man who comes home. Extended section. The secondary characters as mirrors of Homer's damage. The story of what happened to Homer Simpson does not exist in isolation. It exists in a town full of people who have been shaped by the same forces, the same environment, the same institutional arrangements that produced Homer. And the secondary characters of Springfield are not just comic background. They are, if you look at them in the context we have been establishing, a set of mirrors, each one reflecting a different aspect of what living in Springfield's specific conditions does to a person over time. Consider Ned Flanders. Ned is the character most often positioned as Homer's opposite. Where Homer is impulsive, Ned is controlled. Where Homer is irreverent, Ned is devout. Where Homer fails consistently, Ned succeeds consistently in the domains of discipline and virtue. He exercises, he maintains his property, he is a good father, he is a good neighbor. He is, by any objective accounting of character, a better person than Homer in almost every measurable way. And the show punishes him for it relentlessly. Ned's wife was killed at a speedway event, struck by a t-shirt cannon whose trajectory was altered by Homer's attempt to catch a t-shirt. The woman Ned loved was killed, directly and causally, by his neighbor's selfishness. And Ned forgave Homer, not because the forgiveness was easy or because the wound did not run deep, because Ned's capacity to respond with anything other than forgiveness was surgically removed from him in childhood through what the show depicts as behavioral modification therapy. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, beatniks who did not believe in discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral therapy. The therapy worked, in the sense that the adult Ned is not violent. But what the therapy produced is not exactly peace. What it produced is a person whose deepest responses have been artificially suppressed, not resolved, not healed, suppressed, and who lives with the constant low-level effort of maintaining the suppression. Ned's patience is not virtue. It is the absence of the capacity for a different response. His forgiveness of Homer for Maude's death is not grace. It is the trained behavior of a person who was conditioned, at the neural level, to respond to injury with forgiveness because the alternative was conditioned out of him. In the episode where the hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community's well-intentioned but incompetent rebuilding effort produces a structure that immediately collapses, Ned snaps. The suppression fails. The accumulated weight of years of injuries endured, of forgiveness manufactured, of rage managed rather than resolved, comes out in a torrent of specifically targeted insults. That is, in its content, completely accurate. Every person Ned names has wronged him. Every accusation has merit. The fury is not the irrational explosion of a man who has lost perspective. It is the precise accounting of a man who has been keeping track. He is institutionalized for this. The community treats the expression of accurate, legitimate grievance as a pathology requiring treatment. And Ned, who was conditioned to believe that his own anger is the most dangerous thing about him, accepts the institutionalization as appropriate. This is Springfield in miniature. The community treating truth-telling as pathology, the institutional response to accurate grievance being suppression rather than engagement, the person who says true things being managed rather than heard. Ned is what happens when you take Homer's emotional operating system, the compulsive warmth, the suppressed anger, the terror of conflict, and amplify it chemically. Where Homer's suppression of conflict comes from the emotional architecture of his childhood loss, Ned's suppression comes from literal behavioral conditioning. But the end result is similar. A person who cannot express legitimate grievance, who absorbs injury without protest, who maintains the appearance of contentment while the injury accumulates. The difference between Ned and Homer in this reading is not virtue. It is origin. Homer's compliance comes from love and fear. Ned's compliance comes from conditioning. Both of them live next door to each other in a town that rewards compliance and punishes its opposite, in the same system under the same cooling towers, contributing in their different ways to the collective not seeing that keeps Springfield the way Springfield is. Now consider Lenny and Carl, Homer's closest friends at the plant. Lenny and Carl are, in many respects, the show's most consistent portrait of what it looks like to live inside a system that is harming you, and to have adapted to it so thoroughly that the adaptation has become indistinguishable from contentment. They are not stupid. The show has, in specific episodes, revealed that both Lenny and Carl are more capable than their role in the plant's safety structure would suggest. Carl, in particular, has been depicted as thoughtful and perceptive in ways that his position does not reward or require. They are content at the plant. Or they perform contentment at the plant in ways that are sufficiently convincing that the performance has become a kind of contentment in itself. They drink their beer at Moe's after every shift. They watch the same television. They have conversations that are warm and familiar and that operate in a range of reference and concern that is calibrated to exactly the world Springfield provides and no further. They do not ask questions about the plant's safety. They do not organize around shared workplace grievances. They do not, as far as the show depicts, have ambitions or aspirations that exceed what Sector 7G will provide them for the foreseeable future. They have adapted, perfectly and completely, to the environment they are in. This adaptation is the condition that Burns's system needs to function. The plant requires a workforce that is present and productive within its existing structure, and that does not generate the kind of pressure, union activity, regulatory complaints, public advocacy, collective action that might force the plant to change its structure. Lenny and Carl's contentment is the contentment of an adapted population, of people whose expectations have been shaped by their environment to exactly fit what their environment provides. Homer fits into this group. He is comfortable at Moe's with Lenny and Carl in exactly the way that the post-crayon Homer is no longer comfortable there. The fog that connects Homer to Lenny and Carl is not just a cognitive limitation, it is a social belonging. The fog is membership. Being in the fog is being part of the group. And the group, the warm, familiar, beers at Moe's group, is one of the things Homer would lose if the fog lifted permanently. This is the community-level function of the system's effects on cognition. The collective cognitive limitation is not just an unfortunate side effect of the plant's contamination. It is the glue of the community's social structure. People who are operating in the same range of awareness find each other naturally and form communities in that range. The range that Springfield operates in is the range that the plant's environmental effects reliably produce. The community coheres around the level. And anyone who steps outside that level through the temporary removal of a crayon, through the kind of intelligence that Lisa represents, through any mechanism that lifts the awareness above the community's ambient level, finds themselves experiencing exactly the isolation that Homer found when the crayon was out, outside the range, alone. Too aware? This is why Lisa is always, in some sense, alone in Springfield. Not because her family does not love her, they love her deeply, but they love her from within a range of awareness that cannot fully include her awareness. And she lives in the warmth of a family that loves her, with the specific loneliness of someone who can see something that nobody else can see. Burns did not design this social dynamic as a deliberate mechanism of control, but it is a mechanism of control. The community level of awareness is the most powerful form of social control that exists, because it is invisible to the people inside it. It feels like comfort, like belonging, like the ordinary texture of life in a community. It does not feel like control because the people inside it do not have a reference point for what operating above the level would feel like. Homer had that reference point for 22 minutes, and he chose to give it back. That choice, understood in this context, is not weakness. It is the rational response of a person who had a glimpse of what exists above the level and who correctly assessed that the costs of living above the level, the isolation, the specific loneliness of seeing what nobody else sees were, in Springfield, too high to sustain. The system does not need to force anyone to stay inside it. The system makes staying inside it feel like the only livable option. And that, more than anything else, is the nature of the trap. Extended section. What the show is really about. We have been moving through all of these sections toward something, toward the answer to the question that sits underneath the question about Homer's stupidity. Not what made Homer this way, we have answered that, carefully and in detail. But why it matters. What the show is doing with Homer's story. What 36 years of this particular comedy, organized around this particular portrait of this particular kind of damage, is trying to tell us. The Simpsons is, in its most generous and most accurate description, a show about the American middle class. Not a description of it, a portrait. The way that a great portrait is not the same as a photograph. A photograph captures surface. A portrait captures something more. The essential quality, the thing that persists when you remove the surface details and look at the underlying structure. The underlying structure of the American middle class, as The Simpsons has been depicting it for 36 years, is a structure organized around the aspiration towards security and the reality of precarity. Around the idea that stability is achievable and the experience of stability being continuously threatened. Around the love that people feel for their families and the difficulty of providing for those families within the conditions that the economy and the institutions around them provide. Homer is the portrait of this middle-class condition. He works hard at a job he cannot do well, in conditions that are damaging him, for an employer who does not see him because working hard is the model he was given for how to provide for the people he loves. He stays in the job despite the 742 errors, despite the falling asleep, despite the fact that nothing about the job matches his actual capacities, because staying in the job is how you provide. Staying in the job is the deal Abe struck, yes, but also the broader deal. The one that everyone in Homer's class and generation was offered. Show up, contribute, and the system will sustain you and the people you love. The system has not sustained Homer. The system has been extracting from Homer while providing the minimum necessary to keep him extractable. The job, the paycheck, the nuclear security of the plant's continued operation, these things are what Homer has received. And they are enough, just barely enough, to keep Homer from seeing the full shape of what has been done to him. That is the portrait. Not Homer as an individual exception, Homer as the representative case. The person whose experience of the American middle-class deal is being shown to you in its full detail over 36 seasons in the hope the show's hope, whether or not the show has always been conscious of it, as a hope that the accumulation of that detail will eventually produce in the audience the kind of recognition that recognition requires. Seeing yourself in what you are watching. We are Homer. The audience is Homer. Not in the sense of being cognitively limited in the specific ways Homer is limited, in the sense of being people who live in systems that benefit from our not looking too closely at what those systems are doing to us. In the sense of being people who have adapted to conditions we did not choose and that were not chosen with our benefit in mind. In the sense of being people who love our families and go to work and pay our bills and find in the warmth of the people who love us back the thing that makes the whole machinery survivable. That is what the show is about. Not Springfield. Us. Springfield is the mirror. Homer is what we see in the mirror when we look at ourselves in the specific register. The show provides the register that shows you the damage alongside the love, that shows you the system alongside the person it produced, that shows you the trap alongside the thing that keeps the person inside the trap voluntarily. We keep watching because we recognize what we see. We recognize Homer. We recognize the specific quality of his persistence. We recognize the specific quality of his love. We recognize the specific quality of his tolerance for the intolerable, because we practice some version of that tolerance ourselves, in some domain of our own lives, in the specific way that the conditions of our own lives have made necessary. And the show, by showing us Homer for 36 years, by building the portrait one episode at a time, and never quite finishing it, and never quite explaining it, and never quite naming what it is, a portrait of the show is doing something that we have been doing in this video in a much more explicit way. It is trying to make us see, not what Homer is, what we are, what was done to us, what we carry, what we love, and what we refuse to give up, even when giving it up might be the rational choice. Homer does not give up his family. He does not give up the warmth. He does not give up showing up. These things are, by any honest accounting, the most important things he has. They are the things that the system, with all its mechanisms of suppression and limitation, has never managed to take from him. We do not give these things up either. Whatever version of Homer's story we are living inside, whatever trap our own Springfield has placed us in, whatever fog we have agreed to maintain because the clarity is too painful and the isolation of the clarity is too high a price, we keep the warmth. We keep the love. We keep showing up. That is the show. That is the portrait. That is the answer to the question underneath the question. Homer Simpson is not stupid. Homer Simpson is what happens when everything that could have made it easier to be Homer Simpson was taken away systematically, over decades, by forces that benefited from the taking, and what remained was the thing that could not be taken. The love. The love for Marge and for Bart and for Lisa and for Maggie. The love that is expressed imperfectly and inconsistently and with spectacular collateral damage, but that is real, and has always been real, and will be real for as long as the show runs. The love is what the damage was built around. The love is what survived. The love is Homer. And that is the real reason Homer Simpson is the way he is. If you made it all the way here, thank you for spending this night in Springfield with me. Drop your location and time in the comments below. We read every one. And if you want more long stories like this one, subscribe. Good night. End of script. Extended section. The specific texture of Homer's days. There is something worth examining that almost never gets examined, which is the specific texture of Homer's daily life. Not the plot of any given episode. The texture. The quality of the hours between the episodes. The ordinary, unhighlighted rhythm of what it is actually like to be Homer Simpson on a Tuesday that is not the Tuesday the cameras are rolling. He wakes up, he is warm, This is worth noting because it is the first thing and it matters. Homer wakes up warm next to Marge, in the bed that is his bed in the house, that is his house, with the particular morning light coming through the windows of a house he has lived in long enough that every variation of that light is familiar. The ceiling, the familiar weight of the blanket, the sound of the house at that hour, which is different from the sound of the house at any other hour, the way all houses have a specific quiet particular to the morning before anyone else is moving. Homer wakes up into warmth. This is not nothing. This is, by any honest accounting, a great deal. It is the one thing in Homer's life that the system has not been able to corrupt. Because the warmth of waking up beside Marge and inside this house, and inside this morning, this specific, daily, reliable warmth is the thing Homer has organized everything else around. It is the point of the job. The point of showing up to the job even on the days when showing up is the most difficult thing. The point of tolerating the plant, tolerating burns, tolerating the conditions that the plant produces, the warmth is why. It is always why. He gets up. He makes his way to the bathroom, which is the ordinary bathroom of an ordinary house in an ordinary American neighborhood, and performs the ordinary rituals of the morning. Homer's mornings are, in their mechanics, not very different from the mornings of millions of people who are getting themselves ready for jobs they did not choose and that do not fully see them. The shower, the mirror, the clothes. The particular domestic choreography of a house with multiple people in it, all trying to move through the same spaces in the same narrow window of time. Marge is in the kitchen. This is the part of the morning that Homer moves toward with the most specific intent, because Marge in the kitchen in the morning is a complete thing, a good thing. The coffee is on. The smell of whatever Marge is making, the smell of breakfast food in a family kitchen at 7 in the morning, is one of those smells that memory holds onto long after the specific occasion that established it is gone, and Homer has decades of this smell in his memory. The smell is there, and it is home. And Homer enters it the way you enter a room that is warm on a cold morning. He sits at the kitchen table. He eats. He talks to his family in the scattered, overlapping, half-distracted way that family breakfast conversations happen in real households, where everyone is partially elsewhere, the children thinking about their days, Marge tracking the dozen things she is tracking, Homer moving between the food in front of him and the conversation around him, and the first edges of the day ahead. It is not a profound conversation. It is the ordinary breakfast conversation of an ordinary family, and its ordinariness is precisely its value. It is the evidence, renewed each morning, that everything is intact. The family is here, the house is here, the morning is here. Then Homer drives to the plant. The drive is not long. Springfield is not a large town by any geographic measure, and the plant is visible from most of it. So the drive is the kind of drive that can be made on a kind of automatic. The body navigates while the mind runs ahead, or runs back, or simply idles in the space between home and work. Homer's mind on these drives is hard to fully describe because Homer's interior life is one of the things the show has always been reluctant to depict in sustained depth. But you can infer from the quality of the man what the quality of the drive is like. He is probably not thinking about the plant. He is probably thinking about the morning just ended, the specific warmth of it. The specific details that constitute his happiness in the way that happiness for most people is constituted not by large moments, but by the accumulation of small, specific ones. The quality of the coffee, something one of his kids said. The way Marge looked at him before he left. He parks, he goes inside. The plant's interior is described across 36 seasons in enough detail to give a full picture of what it is like to spend 8 hours inside it. The lighting is fluorescent and inadequate. The air has a quality that is distinct from outdoor air in a way that is not exactly unpleasant, but that is constant, and that, over time, the body adapts to the way the body adapts to any persistent environmental condition, not by finding it comfortable, but by registering it as the baseline and therefore not registering it at all. Homer has been inside this air for 30 years. His body stopped noticing it approximately 29 years ago. His workspace is Sector 7G, a console, a chair, a bank of monitors showing readings that Homer learned to interpret during his initial training and that he can read at varying levels of accuracy depending on his alertness at any given moment, well enough to respond to the most obvious deviations. The work, when it is demanding, requires sustained attention. The work, when it is not demanding, which is most of the time, Most shifts, having a specific texture of waiting, punctuated by brief periods of action, does not require sustained attention, and the absence of the requirement for sustained attention is what makes the chair and the warmth of the room and the specific quality of the post-breakfast mid-morning what it becomes for Homer on most days. He falls asleep, not dramatically, not with the comedic collapse of the show's broad moments. The ordinary way that a person falls asleep when they are warm and comfortable, and the thing they are supposed to be attending to is not making sufficient demands on their attention. The small, almost imperceptible drift from alertness to something less than alertness, to something less than that, to the particular suspended state that is not quite sleep and not quite waking, and that is, for Homer, probably the most cognitively comfortable state he regularly occupies. The fog at its most benign. The system at idle. This is what Burns bought with the deal. Not a villain falling asleep at the console in a deliberately sinister way. An ordinary person, shaped by the specific combination of factors we have been tracing across this entire video, occupying the chair in Sector 7G in the way that the specific combination of his history and his environment and his cognitive situation makes almost inevitable. A person who is too limited, through no fault of his own, to perform the role he has been assigned, who was assigned the role precisely because he would be too limited to perform it, who fills the chair and generates the paperwork that says the chair is filled and someone is doing the job, while the job, in the sense that the job's existence implies, goes undone. This is the trap in its operational form. Not a dramatic trap, not a trap that anyone would notice from the outside. Because from the outside, it looks like an employee at his workstation, which is what it is, technically, in the way that things can be technically what they appear to be without being actually what they appear to be. Homer will go home at the end of the shift. He will drive home the same way he drove in, his mind drifting toward the evening instead of the morning now, toward Marge and toward whatever is for dinner, and toward the couch, and toward the television, and toward the warm domestic particular that constitutes the point of all the rest of it. He will come through the door. The house will smell like whatever Marge is cooking. The children will be in various stages of their own evenings. The television will be on or will be about to be on. The beer will be cold. And Homer will sit on the couch, in the warm center of the thing he built everything else around, and the day will be done, and tomorrow will be another version of today, and the loop will continue. This is Homer's life. Not the extraordinary episodes. This. The ordinary Tuesday. The warm morning and the fluorescent plant, and the Sector 7G chair and the warm evening and the couch. This is what the damage looks like from the inside. Not dramatic. Not visible as damage from any external vantage point. Just the ordinary Tuesday of a person who is inside a system that benefits from his being exactly where he is, doing exactly what he is doing, being exactly as limited as he is. And who goes home every evening to the thing that makes it livable. The warmth, the family, the irreducible point of all of it. Homer Simpson's Ordinary Tuesday. The show will never do an episode about this. The Ordinary Tuesday is not an episode, but it is the life. It is the real life. The life that exists between the episodes, in the space the cameras never fill, in the hours that the floating timeline passes through without recording. The Ordinary Tuesday is the most honest portrait of what the damage actually costs and what the love actually provides. Both of them, simultaneously, in the specific texture of a day that is not extraordinary in any way, and that is, for that reason, the most important day to understand. Extended section. The Springfield Medical Establishment in full. We introduced the Springfield Medical Establishment earlier in this script as a contributing factor in Homer's story, a set of institutions that have not looked hard enough at what they would find if they looked, and that may, in some cases, have been actively looking away. Let us examine this more carefully, because the medical establishment is not just a supporting element of Homer's story. It is a story of its own, with its own logic and its own implications. Dr. Nick Riviera, the show's primary recurring portrait of Springfield's medical culture, a doctor who graduated from what the show implies is not a fully accredited medical institution, a doctor whose professional advice ranges from medically dubious to actively dangerous, a doctor who is, by almost any standard of medical competence, not a safe choice for a patient. And yet, Nick has a practice, he has patients, He has patients who return after receiving the kind of advice that most patients would report to a medical licensing board. He operates in Springfield's medical landscape not as an outlier but as a regular participant, alongside Dr. Hibbert, who is competent and who has, over the course of the show, demonstrated actual medical knowledge, and alongside the various specialists who appear in individual episodes. The coexistence of Dr. Nick and Dr. Hibbert in Springfield's medical ecosystem is, under normal circumstances, simply the show doing what shows do, maintaining a roster of recurring characters in different roles to serve different comedic functions. Dr. Nick serves the function of the incompetent doctor. Dr. Hibbert serves the function of the competent but insufficiently aggressive doctor. The distinction serves the show's episodic needs. But under the framework we have been developing, the coexistence suggests something more. Specifically, that Springfield's medical establishment contains both competent practitioners and incompetent ones, and that the distribution of patients between them is not random. The patients who need not to be looked at closely end up with the practitioners who will not look closely. The patients who need specific findings not to be made end up with practitioners who will not make those findings. Homer ends up with Dr. Nick for anything that might produce findings Burns would rather not see on a record. Homer ends up with Dr. Hibbert for routine matters that are not sensitive to the plant's operational interests. This is not established explicitly by the show. The show does not have a scene in which this distribution is organized or discussed, but the show does consistently present Homer's relationship with the medical establishment as one in which significant things are missed, in which findings that should trigger follow-up do not trigger follow-up, in which a crayon can be lodged in a man's brain through his entire adult life and through all of his regular medical appointments without anyone finding it. The crayon question is the one that the medical establishment cannot escape. It is the question the show drops and then does not pick up. A foreign object in the frontal lobe affecting cognitive function in a patient who has been receiving regular medical care for his entire adult life. The question is not how the crayon got there, we know how it got there. Homer as a child inhaled a crayon and it lodged in the only place a crayon could lodge and not immediately kill him. The question is how it was never found. The medical technology required to find a foreign object in a human skull has existed for decades. X-rays, CT scans, standard neurological examinations that would reveal, if not the specific nature of the obstruction, the fact of some obstruction. Homer's cognitive limitations are severe enough that they should, in the course of a normal adult life, prompt at minimum some inquiry. A 40-point drop in IQ. An inability to perform basic safety functions in a nuclear facility. The kind of daily cognitive challenges that Homer navigates as a matter of course. None of this prompted inquiry. No Springfield physician, across Homer's entire adult life, appears to have suggested that Homer's cognitive profile warranted investigation. The crayon was found not through medical investigation but through a plot. Homer underwent a procedure for an unrelated reason, and the crayon was discovered incidentally. Without that incidental discovery, it would presumably still be there. Dr. Hibbert, who is the character most often positioned as the competent member of Springfield's medical community, has treated Homer across dozens of episodes. Dr. Hibbert has delivered Homer's children. Dr. Hibbert has treated Homer for the full range of injuries and illnesses that Homer's extraordinary life has produced. Dr. Hibbert has been Homer's physician in the most meaningful sense available in the Springfield universe. Dr. Hibbert did not find the crayon. This is not attributed in the show to malice. Dr. Hibbert is not depicted as a corrupt practitioner who is suppressing findings to protect Burns. He is depicted as a competent physician who has, somehow, in the course of decades of treating his most frequently injured patient, not found a foreign object pressing on that patient's frontal lobe. The explanation the show provides, implicitly, is that nobody looked. Nobody ordered the scan. Nobody thought Homer's cognitive profile warranted investigation because Homer's cognitive profile, in Springfield, is simply the cognitive profile of Homer. It is what Homer is. It is not a departure from a norm that would prompt investigation. It is the norm itself, established so thoroughly through Homer's entire lifetime of being Homer that no physician who sees him regularly has the reference point to recognize it as deviation. This is the medical establishment's contribution to Homer's story. Not active suppression, active normalization. The treatment of Homer's cognitive situation as the baseline, rather than as a departure from a baseline that would have existed in different conditions. The failure to ask the question, what would Homer look like without this? Because asking that question requires imagining a Homer who is not the Homer everyone knows, and imagining that Homer requires seeing the current Homer as a product of specific conditions rather than as simply the person Homer is. The medical establishment, like the rest of Springfield's institutions, has adapted to Burns's world. The adaptation is not visible as adaptation because it has been complete for long enough that it presents as the natural state of things. The fish have 3 eyes. Homer is cognitively limited. These are simply facts about Springfield, and facts about Springfield that the institutions of Springfield have arranged themselves around rather than against. That arrangement is the establishment's failure, not any single physician's failure, though individual physicians may have contributed, the system's failure. The system that Burns has funded and influenced and shaped across decades of holding monopoly power over Springfield's economy, a system that does not look too closely at what looking closely would cost, because looking closely would threaten the arrangements that sustain the system itself. Homer's crayon was inside the system's blind spot, not accidentally. The blind spot was built to be exactly the size and shape it needed to be to contain what it contained. Extended section. Springfield as American portrait. Let us step back. Let us take the widest angle view available and look at Springfield not from inside its own story, but from the position of what it represents in the broader context of American culture and American television. The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. This date is not arbitrary in its cultural context. 1989 is a specific moment in the story of the American middle class, the moment at which the long post-war expansion of middle-class prosperity was beginning to show, for the first time, the signs of the reversal that would characterize the following decades. The late 1980s were the period in which income inequality in America began the upward trajectory that has continued, largely uninterrupted, to the present day. The moment in which the implicit promise of the American middle-class deal, work hard, stay loyal, and the system will sustain you, was beginning to be quietly renegotiated by the people who held the other side of the deal. The Simpsons arrived at this moment and made a portrait of a family living inside that promise, as though the promise still held, while showing, in the gaps between the jokes and the episodic plots, evidence that the promise was already fraying. Homer's job is secure, but does not provide the quality of life that secure employment should provide. The plant is profitable, but that profitability does not flow back to the people whose labor and whose health make it profitable. The community has institutions, schools, hospitals, local government that nominally exist to serve the community's interests, but that function, in practice, in ways that serve the interests of the system's major player. This is the portrait. Not Springfield as a fantasy of middle-class abundance, Springfield as the diagnosis, as the thing that American middle-class life looks like when you look at it without the mythology that the mythology of American middle-class life provides as default framing. Homer is not a loser. Homer is not the exception to the American middle-class story. Homer is the American middle-class story told without the mythology. The man who works hard at a job that does not see him, for an employer who does not know his name, in conditions that are slowly costing him things he cannot afford to lose, who comes home every evening to the warmth that makes it survivable and who does not, because he cannot, because the conditions of his life have made it impossible, see the full shape of what is being done to him. The show has been making this portrait for 36 years. The joke is the delivery mechanism. The comedy is how the portrait gets inside you without triggering the defenses that a straightforward indictment of the American middle-class condition would trigger. You laugh at Homer falling asleep at the reactor console, but in the moment of laughter, something else is also happening. Something is recognized. Not consciously, not with the particular self-awareness that explicit political argument produces, but with the body-level recognition of someone who sees their own situation in the situation being depicted. We are Homer. This is what the show has been saying for 36 years, not in any single moment, in the accumulation. In the specific way that a portrait accumulates through the addition of detail upon detail upon detail until the image becomes clear, we are the people who stay in jobs that are costing us something. We are the people who tolerate conditions we did not choose and that were not arranged for our benefit. We are the people who come home to the warmth, and find in the warmth the reason to go back tomorrow. We are the people whose most important quality, the love, the persistence, the warmth is the thing the system knows it can rely on to keep us inside the system. Homer's stupidity is the show's way of making this visible. By making Homer's limitations more dramatic than most people's limitations, by locating them at an IQ of 55, rather than the subtler limitations that actual people experience, the show makes the structure of the situation legible. You can see with Homer what is harder to see with real people: the gap between the person's capacity and the role they have been placed in. The way the role was designed to be below the capacity, not accidentally but functionally. The way the system benefits from placing people in roles that their capacity exceeds, because the gap between what the person can do and what the role requires them to do is exactly the gap that the system draws its surplus from. Homer could do more than Sector 7G. Homer did more than Sector 7G, briefly. When the crayon was out, he was brilliant, the show tells us, articulate and capable and aware. Even without the crayon removal, the Homer of Sector 7G exceeds what Sector 7G requires by enough that the excess is visible. The warmth, the love, the genuine human capacity that spills over the edges of the job and expresses itself in the family and the community despite the job's best efforts to contain it. The system does not care about the excess. The system cares about the role. The role is filled. The chair is occupied. The paperwork is generated. The appearance of oversight is maintained. The fact that the person in the chair is capable of more than the chair requires does not register as a problem for the system, because the system is not organized to develop what people are capable of. It is organized to fill the roles it needs filled. This is what 36 years of The Simpsons has been showing you. Not every week explicitly, not in any single episode consciously designed to deliver this argument, but through the accumulation of 800 episodes organized around this one family and this one situation and this one portrait of what the American middle-class condition looks like when you look at it honestly. Homer is the portrait, Springfield is the setting. Burns is the system personified. And we are the audience who has been watching for 36 years and laughing and coming back and bringing our children to watch the same show we watched as children, because the show keeps returning something to us that we cannot get elsewhere. The recognition, the specific, body-level recognition of seeing our own situation in Homer's situation, of seeing the warmth and the damage and the love and the trap all at once, held in the kind of frame that comedy provides, which is the frame that allows you to look at the most painful things without being destroyed by them. That is what The Simpsons is. That is what it has always been. And that is what Homer's stupidity is in service of. Not the joke, the portrait. The 36-year, 800-episode portrait of what the American middle class looks like, feels like, costs, and what it finds at the end of every ordinary Tuesday, waiting at home. The warmth, the love, the family, the couch, and Homer safe inside all of it until tomorrow, when the alarm goes off and the loop begins again. Extended section, the emotional architecture of every Homer episode. There is a structure to the best Homer Simpson episodes that is so consistent it has become almost invisible through familiarity. The structure is, Homer is placed in a situation that exceeds his capacity. Homer navigates the situation through a combination of impulsivity, warmth, genuine effort, and spectacular miscalculation. The situation reaches a crisis. And then Homer does one specific thing, usually small, usually driven not by intellect but by love, that resolves the crisis or, at minimum, produces an outcome that the episode can end on. The structure is a comedy structure. It has the shape of farce or of the kind of situational comedy that has been a staple of American television since the beginning of the medium. Homer gets into trouble and gets out of trouble, and the episode ends. But the specific quality of what Homer does in the resolution moment is not the quality of a comedy character navigating a comedy situation to a comedy ending. The specific quality of what Homer does is the quality of a person operating from his truest capacity, from the thing that the damage did not reach, in a moment when that capacity is exactly what the situation requires. He tells Marge the truth about something he has been afraid to tell her. He shows up for Bart at exactly the moment when Bart most needed him to show up and least expected it. He makes a choice that costs him something: the job, the approval, the easy out, because the thing that costs him is the point he cannot give without losing himself. He loves specifically and concretely in a moment when specific, concrete love is what was needed. These moments are the show's real content, not the plot that produces them, the moments themselves. And the moments are possible only because of the specific emotional architecture that Homer's history produced. The operating system that runs below the fog. The warmth and the love and the persistence that are the things the damage built around. The irreducible core, that 30 years of radiation and one crayon and the loss of his mother and the silence of his father and the deal and the plant and Burns's entire apparatus did not reach. Homer's emotional architecture is the architecture of a person who learned very early that love is the only thing reliable enough to build on. Not because anyone taught him this lesson, because the specific conditions of his early life, the loss, the lie, the limited father who was present without being fully there, taught him by demonstrating the negative, by showing him what was not reliable, by removing, one by one, the other things a child might build on. Security, consistency, the presence of the person who matters most. What remained, when those things were removed, was the love itself, the capacity to love specifically and persistently and without conditions. This capacity, which would in different circumstances have been one quality among many, became in Homer's specific situation the load-bearing wall. Everything else was taken or damaged or constrained. This remained, and Homer built everything on it. This is why the resolution moments work. This is why they hit the way they hit, why episodes that are otherwise primarily comedic produce, in their final minutes, emotional effects that the comedy alone could not produce. Because Homer's love, which is the specific and irreducible core that everything else in his story is organized around, is real. It is not a performance. It is not a function of the plot or the episode structure. It is the genuine article, the thing that survived. And when the episode structure creates a moment that requires it, it is simply there, already there. The way the warmth is already there when Homer wakes up in the morning. The way it is already there when he comes home in the evening. The way it has always been there, through every episode and every season and every 36 years of the loop. The emotional architecture of every Homer episode is damaged person, navigating the world that the damage has made difficult for him, arriving at the moment where the damage does not matter, because what matters is not what the damage affected. Arriving at the moment where what he has the love is exactly and precisely what is needed. That is the architecture. That is why we watch. That is why we have always watched. Not Homer the fool. Homer, the specific, irreducible person whose greatest quality, the one thing the system never touched, happens to be the one quality that the situations the show places him in most consistently require. The resolution moment is the show's argument. Its sustained 36-year argument for the value of the thing that damage cannot touch, for the existence of the thing that damage cannot touch, for the fact that inside every system's most successfully limited subject, there is something the system could not reach. Homer is the argument. Every episode is the argument. 36 years of making the same argument in 800 different ways, through 800 different plots, arriving at the same conclusion every single time. Love survives. The warmth is real. Homer is still there. Final extended section. Good night from Springfield. You have been listening for a long time now. We have covered a great distance together, from Homer's earliest childhood to the deal that Abe made with Burns, from the crayon lodged in the frontal lobe to the plant's 30 years of daily contamination, from Mona's disappearance to the floating timeline that keeps the whole architecture of Homer's trap in permanent suspension. You know the full shape of it now. The whole picture, the crayon and the plant, and the mother who left, and the father who lied, and the deal and the employer who never learned the name of the man doing his most critical safety work, and the medical establishment that looked away, and the community that organized itself around the level the plant's contamination reliably produced, and the love that persisted through all of it, irreducible and intact, at the center of every single episode of 36 seasons of the longest-running American animated series in the history of the medium. You know why Homer Simpson is the way he is. Not because the show told you. The show never told you directly. The show showed you, piece by piece, across nearly 800 episodes, in the gaps between the jokes and the plot moments, in the accumulation of detail that a portrait requires. The portrait is complete now, and what the complete portrait shows you is not what you might have expected when you started asking the question. It does not show you a man who is simply limited. It does not show you the butt of the joke, the eternal fool, the walking punchline that 36 years of cultural shorthand has made Homer seem to be. It shows you a man who was built by a system that needed him limited, who was limited in the specific ways that system required, whose limitations trace back through a series of specific, traceable causes to a set of conditions that were not accidental and were not inevitable, but that operated as though they were both. A man whose irreducible core, the thing the system could not reach, is the thing that makes every episode worth watching and every season worth returning to. Homer Simpson is not stupid. Homer Simpson is a man whose full capacity was systematically constrained by the forces that stood to benefit from the constraint. What remained, after 3 decades of constraining, is not the absence of the capacity. It is the capacity's core, the love, the warmth, the persistence, the specific, targeted, undiminished ability to be present for the people he loves in exactly the way they need him to be present, at exactly the moment they need him most. Burns got the plant, Burns got the safety record. Burns got the deal and the compliance and the 30 years of a man in a chair who could not fully do his job. Homer got the warmth. Homer got the morning light in his bedroom and the smell of Marge's cooking and the weight of his children when they were small enough to carry and the sound of the house at the hour before anyone else is moving. Burns got what the system produces. Homer got what the system cannot take. You can decide for yourself which one of them won. For tonight, that is enough. That is the whole story. The real reason Homer Simpson is the way he is, told from the beginning, told slowly, told in the dark, told for you. Close your eyes now if they are not already closed. The loop will continue without you for a little while. Bart will still be 10 in the morning, Lisa will still be 8. Maggie will still be watching everything with those enormous eyes, quiet behind her pacifier, waiting for the moment she has decided to wait for. Homer will wake up warm, and Springfield will be there when you come back. It always is. Thank you for spending this night in Springfield. Drop a comment with your time and location. We read every single one. If you want more long stories like this, subscribe. Good night. And extended section, The Long Night at Moe's and What It Reveals. There is a place in Springfield that tells you almost everything you need to know about the town if you are willing to sit in it long enough and pay attention. Not the plant, not the school, not Burns's manor on the hill, with its impossible silhouette against the Springfield skyline. The place is Moe's Tavern. A bar on a side street in a small American city, with dim lighting and sticky surfaces and a telephone that rings at intervals, because Bart is at home inventing the specific kind of joke that an 11-year-old who has figured out the rules of language finds endlessly satisfying. Moe's is where Homer goes. It is where Homer has always gone. After the shift, before the dinner, in the compressed window of time that belongs to neither the plant nor the family but to Homer himself, which is perhaps why he fills it by being somewhere that is also not quite his own, that belongs to Moe and to the specific atmosphere. Moe has cultivated over decades of running a bar that is in no meaningful way exceptional, but that has, over time, become necessary to the people who come to it. The people who come to Moe's are a specific population. Lenny is there, Carl is there. Barney Gumble occupies his stool with the specific permanence of a piece of furniture that has been in the same position for so long that the floor beneath it has taken the shape of the weight. These are the regulars. The people for whom Moe's is not a destination in any aspiration sense, but a gravitational field. The place they end up because ending up somewhere is what the hour requires, and this is where the hour reliably deposits them. The conversation at Moe's is the conversation of people who have accepted the terms of their lives and who are not, in this specific hour, examining those terms but simply existing inside them. They talk about sports and about television and about the minor dramas of Springfield's ongoing life and about each other with the easy shorthand of people who have been talking to each other in the same place for a long enough time. That the shorthand is the language now. They do not talk about the plant's safety record. They do not talk about the quality of the water or the shape of the fish in the river or the specific medical question of why a community should have the aggregate health outcomes that Springfield demonstrably has. They talk about the game last night. They refill their glasses. They are there. Homer is among them. Homer is happy among them in the specific way that belonging to a group produces happiness. The warmth of being surrounded by the people who share your context, who know your history, who will be at the next stool when you need someone at the next stool. This happiness is real. It is not the happiness of a man who has been sedated into contentment. It is the genuine article, the warmth of community, the warmth of the familiar. And it is, under the framework we have been tracing, also a symptom. The specific warmth of Moe's is inseparable from the specific level at which Moe's operates. It is a warmth that is available only to people who are inside the level. The post-crayon Homer, in the episode where he removes it, does not fit at Moe's anymore. He sits at the bar, and the conversation cannot reach him, and he cannot reach the conversation. He is outside the range. He sees too much. The warmth of Moe's requires not seeing certain things, and the post-crayon Homer cannot not see them. He puts the crayon back. Moe's becomes warm again. The belonging is restored. The level closes around him. This is the community that the plant's contamination built. Not through deliberate design, through the operation of environmental effects on a population, over time, producing a shared cognitive range, and then the social structures that naturally form around a shared cognitive range. Moe's is not a conspiracy. Moe's is the organic social institution of a population that has been shaped by the same forces into a shared register. It is warm, and it is real, and it is, in its way, beautiful. The warmth of Lenny and Carl and Barney and Homer in the dim light of the bar at the end of the day is not a manufactured warmth. It is the genuine warmth of people who know each other and who are present with each other and who are, in this hour, simply together. The tragedy, if there is a tragedy here, is not the warmth. The tragedy is the level at which the warmth is available. The tragedy is that the warmth requires the not seeing. That belonging to this community means operating in the range the community shares. That the price of the Moe's warmth is the crayon. Homer paid that price consciously. He knew what he was choosing, and he chose it with open eyes, in the sense that someone with 105 IQ who has removed the crayon can have open eyes. He chose belonging over clarity. He chose the warmth of the community he knew over the isolation of the awareness that community would no longer support. You cannot fully blame him. Clarity without community is a specific kind of suffering. The isolation of being the only one in the room who can see something is not a neutral condition. It is its own form of damage. And Homer, who has been navigating the specific damage of loneliness since he was 6 years old and the ground shifted, knew that particular damage better than most. He had felt it in brief. He did not want to feel it permanently. So he chose Moe's. He chose Lenny and Carl. He chose the stool and the beer and the dim light and the conversation that operates in the range the community shares. He chose the warmth that requires the fog. And the fog descended. And Moe's became warm again. And Homer drove home afterward to the other warmth, the warmth that does not require the fog, the warmth of Marge and the children and the house on Evergreen Terrace where the specific, unmediated love that is Homer's deepest capacity is fully available and fully received. He lives inside both warmths, the fog warmth of Moe's and the clear warmth of home. He moves between them every evening, from the bar to the house, and finds in the movement between them something that is, in its way, a complete life. Not the life he might have had, not the life the undamaged Homer would have built, but a complete life. A life with warmth at both ends and the ordinary Tuesday filling the middle. Burns did not take all of it. The deal and the plant and the crayon and the mother and the lie and 30 years of daily contamination did not take all of it. They took the potential. They could not take the actual. The actual is Homer at Moe's with Lenny and Carl in the dim light at the end of the ordinary Tuesday. And then Homer at home with Marge in the warm, specific light of the only place that has ever fully held him. Both of these things are real. Both of these things are his. What was taken was what could have been built on top of them if the conditions had been different, if Mona had stayed, if the crayon had been found, if the plant had been run by someone who understood that the people in the town were people and not simply a resource to be extracted from and discarded. What remained is the warmth. At Moe's and at home, and in every episode that ends with Homer and his family intact and the loop continuing for one more week, the warmth remained. It always will. That is the answer. That is the whole answer. That is the real reason Homer Simpson is the way he is. And the real reason Homer Simpson is still worth 36 years of watching. And the real reason this story, told slowly in the dark to someone who needed somewhere to rest tonight, is worth every word it took to tell. The warmth. It survived. It always survives. Good night. Extended section. The children he made despite everything. If you want to understand the full measure of what Homer Simpson built inside the trap, look at his children. Look at what three people who grew up inside Homer's specific circumstances, inside Springfield's specific conditions, inside the house on Evergreen Terrace with the plant visible from the back window, look at what they became. Bart is 10 years old, and he will always be 10 years old, and at 10 he is already one of the most complete portraits of a specific kind of American boyhood that the show has ever produced. He is the child of a man who is limited and a woman who is capable, and who carries the specific inheritance of both of them in a way that is entirely his own. He is funny. He is loyal to the people he has decided to be loyal to, with a loyalty that, like Homer's love, operates independently of whether the loyalty is earned or deserved. He is mischievous with the specific quality of mischievousness that comes not from malice but from excess energy, looking for direction that the available structures have not provided. Bart's relationship with Homer is the central relationship of the show in many ways. Not the most profound, that is Homer and Marge. Not the most emotionally complex, that is Homer and Lisa. But the most structurally important, because Bart is the child who most directly inherits Homer's situation, and who will, if the show's logic holds, end up in something like Homer's position once the floating timeline releases him from the permanent present of 10 years old. Except Bart has something Homer did not have at the same age. He has Homer. He has a father who is there, who shows up, who is imperfect and frustrating and often actively counterproductive, but who is present. Who loves Bart with the specific, unconditional, embarrassingly sincere love that is Homer's signature quality. Who makes it clear, through every botched attempt and every accidental harm, and every sincere apology and every moment of genuine connection, that Bart is loved, and that the love is not contingent on Bart being anyone other than exactly who he is. This is what Homer did not have at Bart's age. This is the specific thing the loss of Mona took from Homer. Not just a mother's love, though that is significant and its absence marked Homer permanently. The thing it took was the experience of being loved by both parents simultaneously, the security of the doubled love, the sense that there is enough love available from enough directions that any single disruption of it cannot take everything. Homer has given Bart that security, imperfectly, with spectacular collateral damage, but substantially, meaningfully, actually. Bart is not the child of a man who lies about where his mother has gone. Bart is not the child who wakes up one day and discovers that the ground has shifted. Bart has Homer, who is sometimes an earthquake himself, but who is always, at the end of the earthquake, still there. This is Homer's achievement. Inside the trap, despite the damage, despite the crayon and the plant and the deal and everything else, he made a family that is warmer than the family he came from. He made a home that is more present than the home he had. He gave his children something he was not given, and he did it while carrying everything that was done to him, and he managed to do it largely without the children knowing the full weight of what he was carrying. That is not nothing. That is, by any honest accounting, a great deal. That is, in fact, the most significant thing Homer has done. More significant than any single episode plot. More significant than any dramatic moment or resolution or joke. The daily, invisible, unacknowledged achievement of being a more present father than the circumstances of his life would predict or excuse. Lisa is 8 years old and she will always be 8 years old. And at 8, she is already carrying the specific weight that extraordinary intelligence carries in a system that does not reward it. She is the character the show uses to voice the things that need to be voiced, and to notice the things that need to be noticed, and to feel, on behalf of the audience, the specific pain of being the person who sees things clearly in a community organized around collective not seeing. Lisa loves Homer. This is essential to understanding her character. She loves him with full knowledge of his limitations and full knowledge of the gap between what he is and what she needs him to be in order to give her what she wants from a father. She does not stop wanting what she wants because she cannot get it from Homer. But she also does not stop loving Homer because he cannot provide it. She holds both things simultaneously, The love and the wanting, the presence and the absence, with the specific maturity that 8-year-olds who have been paying close attention to adults since they could first observe them develop. Homer's relationship with Lisa is the relationship between the system's most damaged product and the system's most acute observer. Homer is what the system made of a person of limited capacity. Lisa is watching the system with the unflinching attention of someone whose capacity for observation exceeds what the system's social arrangement can comfortably contain. They love each other across the gap between these two positions. The love is real, the gap is also real. And the coexistence of the real love and the real gap is one of the show's most sustained emotional achievements. Maggie is 1 year old, and she is watching everything. And she has been watching everything for 36 years. And what she has assembled, behind those enormous eyes and behind the pacifier and behind the deliberate silence she has chosen, is a complete picture of everything we have spent this video describing. She knows. She has always known. The radiation theory that says she is the mutation, the contamination, made extraordinary rather than limited. The coma theory that says she is the father's deepest prayer for his youngest child projected onto the dream. The reading that says she is simply the most observant member of a family full of observers, the one who took Lisa's lesson about the cost of visibility and drew the opposite conclusion. Whatever Maggie is, and the show has never fully told us what Maggie is, which may be the most significant editorial choice in its 36-year run. She is the product of two parents who loved her before she was born into the specific conditions of Springfield, and who have loved her every day of her 1-year-old life, and whose love has been the primary input available to a mind that the show consistently suggests is something extraordinary. If the love produced Maggie, if the love is the primary ingredient in whatever Maggie has become, then the love has produced something that exceeds what the damage produced. Something that is, in the specific terms of the show's ongoing argument about what love is capable of, the clearest evidence available for the argument's conclusion. Love, applied consistently and without conditions to a specific and extraordinary person over the course of their development, produces something the system cannot predict, cannot contain, and cannot fully account for. Maggie is the show's evidence for its own argument. The argument that what love produces, even inside a trap, even under the conditions that Springfield provides, is not simply more of the same, is not simply another generation of the limited, is something new, something that did not exist before the love made it. She is 1 year old. She is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. She has not yet decided what to do about it, but she will. And Springfield will not see it coming. This is what Homer built. 3 children, each of them shaped by the specific warmth of the home he made for them, each of them carrying some version of his irreducible quality, the love, the persistence, the warmth alongside whatever they are that is entirely their own. Each of them alive and present and complete in the world of the show in ways that would not have existed without him. Burns got the plant. Burns got the deal. Burns got 30 years of a man in a chair who could not do his job. Homer got Bart and Lisa and Maggie. Tell me again which one of them won. Tell me again, slowly, while the loop continues and the ordinary Tuesday turns into Wednesday and the house on Evergreen Terrace holds its warmth against the dark and the kids are upstairs and Marge is beside him and Homer is exactly where he has always wanted to be. Tell me again, a final note on the loop. The loop is not a prison in the way prisons are usually described. Prisons have walls you can see, rules that are written down somewhere, keepers whose job it is to enforce the fact of the confinement. The loop has none of these things. The loop is invisible from the inside. The loop looks, from the inside, like a life. Like the ordinary texture of Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday, each one structured by the same warmth at the morning, and the same plant in the middle, and the same warmth again in the evening. This is the loop's particular genius. It does not require visible walls because it does not require the people inside it to know they are inside it. It requires only that the conditions that produce it remain in place. The plant, the deal, the crayon, the mother's absence and the father's lie, the medical establishment that looks the appropriate distance away, the community that has organized itself around the level. These conditions, operating together over decades, produce the loop as their natural outcome, as the shape that a life takes when it has been shaped by these specific forces in these specific proportions over this specific length of time. Homer does not experience the loop as confinement. Homer experiences the loop as home, as the return, each evening, to the warmth that is the point of everything. As the ordinary Tuesday that is, when you are living it from the inside, simply life, simply the texture of being alive in Springfield in the house on Evergreen Terrace with the family that is yours. We have been watching the loop for 36 years. We have been watching it and laughing at it, and bringing our children to watch it with us and coming back to it across decades of change in the world outside the loop, change that the loop does not reflect, because the loop does not change. Bart is 10, Lisa is 8. The beer is cold, the couch receives them, and every time we come back, something is returned to us. Some version of the recognition we came for, the recognition that the loop is familiar, that we know the shape of it, that the warmth at the center of it is the same warmth we are organized around in our own lives, in our own loops, in our own ordinary Tuesdays. This is the show's final gift. Not the laugh, though the laugh is real. Not the plot, though the plot has moments of genuine brilliance. The recognition, the 36-year, 800-episode act of holding up a mirror and saying, "This is familiar, is it not? This warmth in the middle of the damage, this love that persists through the trap, this man who keeps showing up, you know this, don't you? You recognize this? We do. We always have. That is why we are still here. Good night, Springfield. Good night, Homer." The loop continues.